Now, you want to be you'd like to produce movies yourself, wouldn't you? You're going to put up a whole complex, I understand, in Atlanta, that you want
Well, really, we just bought MGM. We owe a lot of money. We're trying to decide how to pay our debt down and try and still stay in the movie business. That's what we'd like to do.
What is money to you? Is it just a tool? Is money important itself, just to have money?
No, it's, you know, I used to be a Rotarian, and my father was one, and their motto is, he profits most who serves the best. My life was sailing and everything. My life is an adventure. But I'm also a businessman. You have to make money in order to stay in business, and if you have bigger profits, you can make more acquisitions and grow. So that's basically my interest in making money. You've got to make money to stay in business.
In 49 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar, fresh off an 8-year campaign conquering Gaul, led a single legion south toward Rome. Now, when Julius Caesar reached the Rubicon River, he stood at both a literal and symbolic crossroad with an important decision to make, one that would ultimately change the course of history forever. He could obey Roman law, stay north of the river and out of the realm of Rome, and remain a celebrated hero of the Roman Republic. Or he could cross it, defy Roman law, and risk being branded a traitor and threat to the Republic. The choice was Caesar's, and Caesar's alone. Upon making his decision, Julius Caesar said, "Alia iacta estor." The die is cast. 2,034 years later, Ted Turner faced his own Rubicon moment. A United States District Court had just upheld CBS's poison pill provision, which I covered at the end of the last episode. This ruling made Ted's dream of taking over the Tiffany network much more difficult and far more expensive. Now the question was, would Ted go all in? You know, burn the boats Cortez style and cross his own Rubicon with an even bigger offer, loaded with more cash and junk bonds than before, for a network that really didn't want him. Remember, they had said that he didn't have the moral fitness to run a network, especially CBS. Or would he do something he rarely did? Step back, tip his cap to CBS's management, and live to fight another day. Ted could double down and bet it all. Everything he'd built over the last 15 years, a company that had grown more than 100-fold since 1970, including TBS, CNN, Headline News, and the Atlanta Braves. Or he could fold his hand, walk away, keep his empire intact, so that he could play the game another day. Those were the stakes, my friends. These are the kinds of decisions that require more than just a massive bet, but also an incredible level of confidence, especially when the outcome is so uncertain. And hey, we've all had to make big life decisions, right? Our own proverbial Rubicon, so to speak. Like whether to take the job or not, move cities, is he or she the one? Those kinds of decisions, right? Big decisions. You know what I mean. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been stuck in a moment trying to decide whether to move forward or pull back on a massive decision, when suddenly, as if it was like an act of God, the phone rings? Now, imagine this call doesn't just change your future, but it changes the future of the entire media industry forever. And answering it means risking everything you've built and walking away from over $20 million already spent on trying to buy CBS to chase a completely different dream, just so you can grow, so that you can have another shot at making history. All of this is a new path, a completely different path too. Would you do it? This kind of decision changes everything, not just your life, but thousands of people directly, and multiples of that indirectly, and the future of the entire game. What would you do? Would you say, fuck it, let's go? Or would you stop, rethink things, and completely shift your entire strategy? We all know what Gaius Julius Caesar decided. He crossed the Rubicon and subsequently changed history forever. But crossing that river also sealed his fate. For Ted Turner, the call came in late July 1985 from Kirk Kerkorian, majority owner of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a.k.a. MGM Studios. Ted said, quote, "He said he wanted to stay in the movie business on a smaller scale and intended to keep United Artists, but all of his other assets, including MGM, were on the table. He had retained Drexel Burnham to prepare to sell the company at auction with a target date of August 6th. The asking price would be $1.5 billion, nearly double what these assets were trading for on the open market. But if we submitted an offer before then, we could stop the auction and keep the deal private. We had just 2 weeks to make a deal, and the price was high. But I decided to go for it, end quote. Ted saw his audacious no-cash deal for CBS falling apart, and instead of doubling down with more cash and debt, in effect, he decided to cross his Rubicon. He picked up the phone, did an about-face, and that decision changed media forever. In this episode of Media Moguls, we'll shed our 80s power suit and pack our swimsuit and sunglasses for Ted Turner's expansion west to Hollywood and how it nearly destroyed everything he'd ever built. Ambition is one thing, but ego, oversight, and a shitload of debt? Well, that's a whole different story. I'm Web Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga. Ted Turner buys a studio. Play my theme music.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
What we're doing right here on this spot is the greatest advance in television since television was invented.
They're risk takers, rule breakers, and empire builders. These are the stories of the visionaries who transform media forever.
Whatever I have is being put at risk on this project, and if it's not successful, I'll be looking for a job.
Going to Bernard Shaw.
Tear down this wall.
From Highbar, this is Media Moguls.
We won't be signing off until the world ends. We'll be on, we will cover it live.
Now, before I get into all the nitty-gritty of what Kirk Kerkorian was offering Ted, we need to talk about who Kirk Kerkorian was, because the deal with him was unlike a deal with anyone else. So I'll keep this part quick, but it's important to explain. First, like Ted, he was a unique, one-of-a-kind mogul, which comes with the territory, right? Normal people don't tend to become larger-than-life figures, especially in Hollywood. Kirk Kerkorian came from humble beginnings. His father was an illiterate immigrant farmer who struggled to make ends meet. Kirk grew up in Los Angeles, learned English, dropped out of high school, and learned how to fight. You could say his childhood was a crash course in survival, trust, loyalty, and hard work. Who else does that sound like? In William C. Rimple's biography on Kerkorian, aptly named The Gambler, he wrote that Kerkorian, quote, studied in the school of hard knocks, end quote. Can you imagine someone saying that about you? Hey, Webb, how was college? Oh, no, I didn't go. I went to the school of hard knocks. You got to earn that shit, man. After World War II, Kerkorian took $12,000 and started trading airplanes. He traded airplanes, not stocks, airplanes. From there, he launched an airline, sold it in 1962, bought it back, took it public, and then kept most of the stock. 7 years later, he sold it again, this time to Transamerica for $104 million. This buying, selling, buying back assets would become a pattern throughout his career, even with, yes, MGM. In 1969, Kerkorian took control of MGM, which is one of the 5 big Hollywood studios, complete with its iconic roaring lion at the beginning of every film. Now, from the start, Kerkorian showed little interest in the actual movie business. That's what makes him so interesting. Instead, he focused on the MGM Grand Casino hotels in Las Vegas and Reno, Nevada, which he later sold for $286 million. I told you, he buys and sells. This guy knows how to make money. And that's not to say the studio paused or slowed their output or anything like that while he was the owner. But it just wasn't his priority. And let's be honest, if you looked at their slate in the late 70s and early 80s, the results would make that pretty clear. Still, MGM was doing just fine because of money from pay TV channels like HBO and Showtime. You know, they needed to license movies from the studios. The studios hated the fact that HBO and Showtime existed, so they would just raise their rates, raise those licensing fees. We've talked about this each episode. And alongside, video cassette sales largely sustained the company, which led Kerkorian to create MGM UA Home Entertainment Group, which he also took public. Regardless, even though Kerkorian was incredible at managing assets, you know, the flipping, the buy-in, the selling, and being unsentimental about it, which is very difficult, he never managed to turn MGM UA into a truly successful studio. Not that it really mattered, since, there's only 5 major studios, and he was still personally worth $600 million. When there's only that few studios, and you have MGM, which at the time had the biggest film library, that kind of history is important. It's also very valuable. In the July 7th, 1986 issue of Fortune magazine, they described, quote, "Despite MGM's generally dismal financial performance under Kerkorian, he managed to enhance its value. A mystifying shaman of high finance, he stays aloof from operations. Instead, he alters the structures of his companies and dazzles investors into paying premiums for the same old assets," end quote. Okay, so my friends, these were Kirk Kerkorian's skills. Now, outside of business, he was actually a very private guy. He avoided interviews for most of his life, and yet he was able to keep a pretty active social life with celebrity friends like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. He even vacationed and double-dated with Cary Grant. He was often spotted at public events and featured in gossip columns, and kept close ties with the Hollywood elite, while making sure nobody mistook him for Howard Hughes, the famously reclusive genius. And yet, Kerkorian lived simply. Reminds you of someone, huh? He traveled without an entourage, carried his own bags, and drove himself, usually in his Jeep Cherokee or Ford Taurus, and was even known to jog through Beverly Hills without security. He always paid for his own meals and hotels, even at his own properties. In The Gambler, Rimple described how, quote, "Once after a business trip to New York, Kerkorian was halfway to LaGuardia Airport when he ordered his driver back to the city. He had forgotten to tip the maids at the Pierre Hotel," end quote. Kerkorian was generous, but private. He donated millions of dollars to charity while strictly insisting that those donations stay secret. His foundation would ultimately give over $1 billion away, much of it to Armenia after a devastating earthquake. And let's be honest, when you're gone, you can't take it with you, right? Now, I've always admired billionaires like Ted Turner and Kirk Kerkorian, who drove their regular cars like the rest of us and didn't surround themselves with yes men. They made the decisions and they moved forward. They didn't need tons of security. It wasn't an ego play. They were in business because they enjoyed it. They didn't waste their money on things that lost value the moment it left the store. And there's a lot of big lessons there. And yet, when it came to business, with a capital B, Kirk Kerkorian wasn't just a shark. He was a great white, an alpha predator. He liked to tell people, never look back. And he loved nothing more than the thrill of risk, which for a man who owned casinos and a movie studio says a lot. He once told the Los Angeles Times, quote, "Life is a big craps game. I've got to tell you, it's all been fun," end quote. Now, one thing Kirk Kerkorian wasn't was a pushover. Far from it. You see, he was the king of negotiations, one of the world's best, one of the greatest ever. And when I think about my Mount Rushmore of dealmakers in the 1980s, yes, I think about this kind of stuff. It's an era full of outsized personalities and massive high-stakes deals. Of course, you got a number of guys on it. You've got Michael Milken on Wall Street, better put, in Beverly Hills, working for a Wall Street firm. Michael Ovitz in Hollywood for CAA. But right there with them was certainly Kirk Kerkorian. He was a master at turning words into cash. Now, from all my research, it seems that Ted and Kirk first met in 1980, when Ted called Kerkorian to, quote, "to see if I could acquire MGM through merger, where we would have been partners." And every year, Kerkorian kept saying, "No, no, no." He never took us seriously, end quote. Even back in 1980 and 1981, Ted's goal with a potential MGM merger, or really any merger with a Hollywood studio for that matter, was to secure access to a steady supply of quality entertainment programming. He needs more content without having to license it, right? Remember, Ted was concerned that as an independent programmer for the Superstation, TBS was vulnerable to Hollywood raising licensing fees, or even Hollywood deciding, we want to also get into distribution and launching their own cable networks that would threaten his business. But MGM wasn't for sale. In fact, in 1981, Kerkorian went shopping instead, where he bought his own additional studio, United Artists, which was then owned by Transamerica. For some reason, as a financial service company, they owned United Artists. We're starting to get into the conglomerates era where even a company like Coca-Cola, I believe they owned Columbia Pictures, which makes no sense in 2025, but in the 80s it did. Years earlier, Transamerica had made Kerkorian rich when they bought his Trans International airline, and this time he was kind of returning the favor, buying United Artists from them. Anyways, United Artists was a legendary name in Hollywood history. It'd been around from the early days of the film industry to the new Hollywood of the 1970s. Under Transamerica, United Artists was reeling from a string of box office disasters, none bigger than the famed Heaven's Gate debacle by Michael Cimino, who won an Oscar before that film with Deer Hunter, and then got carte blanche to basically destroy a movie studio with one movie, thanks to its massive $44 million budget and endless overages, which nearly sank the studio, making it ripe for a sale. And here's a crazy coincidence. The very same weekend Heaven's Gate opened to empty theaters, a fire broke out at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas. You know, if you listen to our episode part 2 on CNN, you'd know this fire pretty well. CNN broadcasted in full, providing the power of 24-hour news in their first 6 months. Just a few years earlier, it would have just been a local story in Las Vegas with maybe a minute or two on the national news. But now with Ted Turner's cable news network, CNN, they could turn it into a nonstop developing breaking news story anytime they wanted. It's funny how all these moments kind of intersect, right? So by the spring of 1981, Transamerica wanted out of the movie business. And who could blame them? You know, making movies and then marketing them and hoping people show up in theaters is a risky business. It's closer to being in the casino business than it is being in financial services, to tell you the truth. So making movies has always been risky. You do it in volume. We don't do that very much now. You know, a lot of the studios say, oh, we're going to make 10 movies this year and hope that they hit. They used to make 20, 25, 30, and you make them for a lot of different audiences. Some work, some don't. We don't really do that now, but it's always been risky. And back then, there was no VHS market or even Blockbuster video. So if you bombed at the theaters, it was over. There was nothing to help offset those losses, you know, where a movie could develop a cult following after the fact. I mean, so many movies that we grew up on, like Office Space or The Big Lebowski, or even the movie Heat. A lot of those movies didn't necessarily perform well at movie theaters, but then you had DVDs, and those proved the long tail for those movies and helped not just offset loss, they helped make profits. But when the DVDs go away, now we have streaming, and you're hoping that the overall streaming will work out. Anyways, after the Heaven's Gate debacle, Transamerica was ready to bail, and Kirk Kerkorian realized that he needed a better distribution arm for MGM, and also wanted access to United Artists' crown jewels. Now, when I talk about their crown jewels, I'm talking about James Bond, the Pink Panther, and the Rocky franchises. Kerkorian also had his eye on reclaiming the rights to older MGM classics that United Artists distributed, like Gone with the Wind, Dr. Zhivago, Ben-Hur, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, these are really iconic films, right? Historical, Oscar-winning films, epics. So, in May 1981, Kerkorian's MGM bought United Artists for $350 million in cash and bonds. MGM chairman Frank Rosenfeld told the New York Times, quote, MGM would benefit in that it would become totally the master of its own fate in deciding how its product is marketed. At the present time, the control of the marketing rests with another entity. If this deal is approved, then it's MGM making the ultimate decisions, end quote. And that's what Kerkorian really wanted. Control over his studio's marketing, distribution, and especially United Artists Film Library. And what a library it was, with 1,500 MGM films, 800 pre-1950 Warner Brother movies, and nearly 1,000 United Artists features. Now, when I'm talking about United Artists, I'm talking about classics from their founders, including Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, Mary Pickford's Pollyanna, and Douglas Fairbanks' Robin Hood, and The Three Musketeers. The collection even included 32 films featuring President Ronald Reagan back when he was an actor. Now, to me, this feels like one of those moments where everyone knew that film libraries were valuable, but the market hadn't fully priced it in yet or figured out how to actually unlock that value. Like, other than cable channels like HBO or TBS or Showtime, where could you actually air all these movies and then actually generate real revenue from the full library? Remember, the VHS market was still in its infancy, but that time would come. Anywho, in 1981, Ted secretly approached Kerkorian about buying MGM United Artists. You see, he was just finding it harder and harder to get movies for the Superstation at the same low rates he'd enjoyed in the 70s. So he began exploring new programming options. Remember, Ted had seen this coming since 1979's congressional hearings on retransmission consent and copyright fees, which I covered in episode 5 on the Superstation. Ted knew rates were going to continue rising, and he needed more programming than ever. So, with networks like TBS and HBO becoming increasingly dependent on Hollywood's supply of programming, Hollywood might have hated seeing their films on HBO or TBS, but they couldn't resist the easy money, and that's what it was. But, Ted needed lower fees, and that wasn't going to happen. Those rates were going to continue going up. If you read James Andrew Miller's book, Tinderbox, which is on the history of HBO, you get a lot of color into this problem with them acquiring movies, and that's why over time they went into original programming, even though Hollywood hated the fact that they were doing that as well. You'll never be able to make your own TV shows. You'll never be able to make your own movies. And over time, we see that the people who say you'll never be able to, they get supplanted. Same thing happened with Netflix when Netflix started doing it themselves. So at the time, it's still 1981, 82. In terms of at scale, monetizing their film library, they're only monetizing it on cable. Like the network executives before him, Kerkorian didn't take Ted seriously at first, but unlike all those guys, Kerkorian liked Ted. They were cut from the same cloth. Both were born fighters, right? At the heart of their 1981 meeting was MGM's film library, which Ted saw as the crown jewel. Kerkorian, however, assumed Ted just wanted to own a studio and doubted Ted could meet his $2 billion asking price. Now, he couldn't. He couldn't pay it, especially in 1981. Remember, the junk bond era that Michael Milken would usher in was still a few years away. So their meeting ended cordially, with Kerkorian leaving the door open for future discussions, just in case. He knows Ted wants the library. It's always an ongoing conversation. It's not burning the boats and saying, fuck you, we're done. With Kerkorian, a deal is never over. Fast forward 2 years to early 1983. Kerkorian flies to Atlanta to meet Ted in person to discuss a potential partnership between a studio and a cable programmer. Now, it's important to note that Kerkorian at the time was 65 years old and Ted was 44, so he's 21 years younger. And by then, Kerkorian saw Ted's Superstation as a great potential outlet for MGM's film library, and that's what got him to Atlanta to meet Ted. Now, at their meeting, Ted passionately, and he doesn't have any other way of doing this, pitched a 50-50 business partnership where TBS would heavily promote MGM's new releases, and in return, MGM would feed TBS a steady stream of programming from its film library. In his memoir, Ted described these early pre-1985 talks with Kerkorian, quote, "In the early 1980s, about the same time I began my exploratory meetings with the executives of the broadcast networks, I also considered combining Turner Broadcasting with one of the movie studios. As a small independent programmer, I was concerned that our access to quality entertainment product would be vulnerable. Like the networks, the Superstation relied on Hollywood suppliers for most of our series, and I could easily foresee a time when the studios, under pressure from the broadcast networks, would either hike our license fees so high that we would no longer have a profitable business, or start cable networks of their own and compete with us using their own programming. If we could merge with a pre-existing studio, we'd at least guarantee a steady supply of product from our partner. My most promising discussions along these lines were with Kirk Kerkorian, who owned control of MGM UA. Kirk was based in Los Angeles, and he was curious enough about my company to fly to Atlanta for our initial meeting. I liked him. He was an astute, clever businessman who seemed to have the Midas touch when it came to investing and trading in industries ranging from airlines to entertainment to hotels. He was one of the most visionary and successful developers of Las Vegas. Kirk understood how Turner Broadcasting would benefit from a guaranteed supply of entertainment programming, and I showed him the benefits we could provide to MGM. Our combined company could create an instant advantage over our competitors by using unsold advertising inventory on our cable networks to promote MGM's new releases and home videos. Since so many people who watch the Superstation were movie fans, it would be a particularly effective promotional platform for new MGM releases. His 50% stake in MGM UA was roughly equal value to my 80% of Turner Broadcasting, so I proposed that we form a 50-50 partnership and run the company together. I thought our initial meetings went great, but in later years, Kerkorian confided that he wasn't sure what to make with me. He thought I seemed a little young. I was in my early 40s and he was in his late 60s, and others had apparently warned him that I might be a little brash and unpredictable. These concerns led him to politely pass on doing a deal at that time. It wasn't until the subsequent months when he observed my handling of our run at CBS that he decided that I might be someone with whom he could do business, end quote. So what's really interesting about this is Ted is basically pitching TBS as a promotional vehicle to promote new movies in the theaters while utilizing the film library. So clearly Kerkorian was impressed by Ted's vision and boundless energy. He didn't have any other way, but he still hesitated to make this kind of massive 50-50 type of deal. And I understand his rationale. I mean, Ted was kind of unpredictable, crazy like a fox kind of thing. But, it was something that also seemed to be reported on by all the news outlets. Whether it was true or not, they kind of make Ted to be this crazy guy. But crazy guys don't build CNN. Crazy guys don't create the Superstation. Crazy guys don't buy the Atlanta Braves and invest in it or get on the satellite. Eccentric guys do. Boundless energy guys do. But his issue with Ted's age makes a little less sense to me. Still, as we'll soon see, this was a bit of a pattern for Kerkorian, who'd get intrigued by a possible deal or target, then hold back and wait for his perfect moment to strike. A habit he'd repeat throughout the 80s, into the 90s, and almost always to his bank account's benefit. I told you he's on my Mount Rushmore of 1980s negotiators and dealmakers. And sure enough, just 2 years later, in the spring of 1985, Ted's audacious bid to take over CBS put him right back on Kirk Kerkorian's radar. Now, in the last episode, I broke down every aspect of Ted's attempted takeover of CBS. His thinking, reasoning, why he wanted to own a network, how he wanted to get bigger and needed better distribution. And so far this episode, I've talked about Hollywood and supply and how he wanted more predictable costs for the Superstation and needed to get bigger. He needed to get bigger because everyone's starting to get bigger. But here's the thing. It wasn't just about programming or locking in predictable lower costs for the Superstation. Not at all. You see, for Ted, owning a studio was about something more. And I'll explain to you what that something more was in just a minute. Now, TBS needed cheaper programming, and lots of it in order to stay on top as the best performing national cable network. But in the mid-80s, there were other reasons for wanting to own a studio besides just supplying programming to keep your costs lower or more predictable. Now, it helps to know that before 1970, the networks produced many of their own shows, often leaving studios out of their schedules. In the 70s, Hollywood fought back, lobbying the Justice Department to pass financial interest and syndication rules to stop the networks from monopolizing content production and reruns. These rules basically forced the networks to go from being landlords, where they owned the entire building, to being more like supers who oversaw programming but rented it from the studios and indie producers like Aaron Spelling. For Hollywood, it was a huge win. And it came just as syndication was booming, and Americans were watching more television than ever. Then, in 1983, President Reagan, almost certainly influenced by his former agent, the king of Hollywood himself, Lew Wasserman, sided with the studios, deciding not to relax the FCC rules as planned around network ownership. But with those rules set to expire by the end of the decade, new network owners like Cap City's Tom Murphy, who now owns ABC, who I consider one of the best media operators at the time, saw an opportunity. If they could own parts of the shows they aired, it would be a goldmine. Partnering with studios to produce content could also change the financial incentives and help control rising costs. And politically, deals between the networks and studios would make life easier in DC, since they certainly didn't want to pick sides between two powerful donor industries. So, if you're Ted Turner, owner of TBS and CNN, and you can't buy a network, remember they're all off the table by the end of 85, what would your next best move be? Think about it. Wouldn't it be owning a studio, owning the supplier? That way you could profit from the shows the networks were renting for broadcast and get a decades-old film library in the process? Exactly. And it didn't hurt that cable was growing so fast while network audiences were shrinking every year. By late July 1985, Ted was still in the fight of his life against CBS. Remember, in order to block his takeover, CBS swallowed a poison pill, which was a move that ultimately hurt their long-term future, just to keep Ted Turner, Southerner, renegade, Captain Outrageous, the mouth of the South, from taking over their institution. And I don't use the word institution lightly there. CBS was an institution, but sometimes that's not a good thing, right? So, as CBS celebrated its win in the United States District Court in Atlanta, Ted, like Julius Caesar at the Rubicon, weighed his next move. Should he bet his company on a bigger bid for CBS despite the poison pill? Or should he walk away and live to fight another day? Either way, his $5 billion bid for CBS was looking more hopeless by the hour. And the question was, raise his bid or walk away? He needs to get bigger. He knows that. Remember, before CBS enacted the poison pill, his bankers thought they could handle debt on a bid as high as $7 billion, and so far, he'd only gone up to $5 billion. Perhaps if he added more cash, he'd have a shot. Another option was litigation, but this would have to be the type of litigation that people call scorched earth. And as we all know, scorched earth litigation comes with two massive downsides. One, it's really expensive, and two, no matter the outcome, win or lose, rarely, if ever, does someone come out of it better. By now in our story, you know Ted had spent years cultivating his folk hero image in the South. Why risk tarnishing that image with more courtroom battles against CBS? And then the phone rang. But it wasn't his bankers or lawyers. No, it was MGM's Kirk Kerkorian, who asked if he had a minute to talk. Then he told Ted he was thinking of reducing his role in the film industry and asked, Ted, would you be interested in buying MGM Studios? Now, when I think about this phone call, it's like a scene out of a movie, right? Almost like Gordon Gekko calling Bud Fox from the beach with his super 80s massive cell phone, that beige brick, and saying,
Yeah.
Money never sleeps, pal. Just made 800,000 Hong Kong gold. It's been wired to you.
Play with you. You done good, but you gotta keep doing good. I showed you how the game works. Now school's out.
Mr. Gecko, I'm there for you 110%.
No. You don't understand. I want to be surprised.
Astonish me, pal. New info. I don't care where or how you get it. Just get it.
This is your wake-up call, pal. Go to work.
It's got everything from a protagonist stuck with a huge decision to make, and then a figure from his past, someone he admired, who's very successful, offering another path forward. And not just any path, but owning a company Ted had dreamed of owning. One that would also solve a lot of Ted's problems. Then Kerkorian laid out his terms. And these terms, well, they're the kind of terms that would make anyone's eyes pop and their jaws drop. Ted described the phone call in his memoir, quote, late July 1985, just as CBS was formulating its poison pill provisions, Kerkorian called to tell me he had changed his mind about doing a deal with me. He said he wanted to stay in the movie business on a smaller scale and intended to keep United Artists, but all his other assets, including MGM, were on the table. He had retained Drexel Burnham to prepare to sell the company at auction with a target date of August 6th. The asking price would be $1.5 billion, nearly double what these assets were trading for on the open market. But if we submitted an offer before then, we could stop the auction and keep the deal private. We had just 2 weeks to make a deal and the price was high, but I decided to go for it. I hadn't given up on CBS at this point, but I knew that it was going to be an uphill and expensive battle against a company that was determined to fight me off. Now I had the willing seller of a studio on the line, and MGM wasn't just any studio, end quote. So, to sum everything up, Kerkorian's offer to Ted was this. If he acted fast, he could have MGM without a bidding war. But he only had 2 weeks to decide, and it had to be at Kerkorian's price. Now, my friends, that is an offer and an incredible negotiating tactic. That is how you get on Mount Rushmore of negotiating. What's so interesting to me is how Kirk Kerkorian tapped right into Ted's motivations to both grow and secure TBS's future, while also playing on his instincts to move fast and close deals, like without reading contracts. He was known to not read contracts. And I can't help but think Kerkorian knew that Ted wouldn't want to risk losing another shot at a company-changing deal, right? He's about to lose CBS. Why don't we offer him MGM at an insane price? And also, let's not give him any time to figure it out. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think? Let me know. Shoot me an email or DM. The info is in the show notes because I'd love to hear what you think. I think it's a brilliant negotiating tactic, and it's something John Malone would do all the time. Anyways, we all know Ted liked to move fast and hated getting bogged down by lawyers or drawn-out processes. I can totally relate. They're not on the same timeline as we are. When you're a founder, you move fast. When you're a lawyer, you bill hours. Those aren't necessarily compatible things, right? And lawyers are expensive. Due diligence takes time. Ted Turner didn't like either. And you know what? Kirk Kerkorian knew full well Ted had been eyeing either a studio or a network for years. So why not put him on a 2-week clock, see what happens, right? Honestly, it's a brilliant move. Shrewd, yes, but brilliant. They're not mutually exclusive. And at his price, too, it's double the market value. No negotiations. You're either all in or you're all out. For Ted, buying MGM meant buying a Hollywood studio with 61 years of history, plus a vast film library, which was the biggest of any studio. It was a chance to take TBS and any future channels he might create to a different level, another level, by cornering the market on movies. At least that's what he thought. I don't know if you can actually corner the market on movies, but you can become dominant if you have the biggest film library in 1985. Owning MGM would free Ted from the grip of content producers, TV networks, and movie studios that all had the ability to shut out cable networks like his, limit his access to quality programming, and drive up their costs. It would give him control over his own content and, most importantly, his own destiny. Though, as we'll see, what's often promised in the deal-making process isn't necessarily what gets delivered, right? So, what was in MGM's library? To me, it's unbelievable. I'm going to name some movies in here, and you're going to go, oh my God, they owned all of that? Let's quote Ted, okay? Quote, in addition to ongoing production capacity, they also own the largest movie library in the world, home to some of the greatest films ever made, including classic musicals like Meet Me in St. Louis and Singin' in the Rain, epics like Dr. Zhivago, family titles like The Wizard of Oz, and my all-time personal favorite, Gone with the Wind. In addition to the historical output of MGM and United Artists, Kerkorian also owned the RKO library, which included Citizen Kane and the original King Kong, and all the Warner Brothers films released before 1948, including Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon. Taken together, the library controlled by MGM UA accounted for about 35% of all feature films ever made. And even though most of MGM's movies are pretty old, no other single studio had more than about 10 or 12%. On top of their feature film collection, they also owned about 1,000 theatrical cartoons, including MGM's Tom and Jerry series and Warner's pre-1948 Looney Tunes, such as Bugs Bunny and Porky Pig. They even controlled the rights to the TV special How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Other buyers might have looked at this library and placed a value based on only the syndication and sales of home videos, a new and growing category, but one that was driven by newer releases. But these assets were worth far more to me. The Superstation had a huge appetite for movies and cartoons, and MGM's collection would give us critical mass. I also believe that if I controlled enough programming, I could launch a second entertainment channel and charge subscription fees. The Superstation's revenues came solely from advertising, as FCC rules still did not allow us to redistribute the WTBS signal, let alone charge a fee for it. Different from MGM's other likely buyers, the other studios, Turner Broadcasting generated profits and created asset value by building networks. For us, this was truly a one-of-a-kind opportunity, end quote. And on top of all that, MGM's cartoon library with Tom and Jerry, The Grinch, Bugs Bunny, Porky Pig, and the rest of the Looney Tunes could easily support its own 24-hour cartoon channel. In fact, it eventually would. And we'll talk about that another time. But that's not all. MGM also came with its own backlot real estate and decades of movie making and production know-how. Think about it. In 1985, there were only 5 major studios, and they were the gatekeepers for the kind of programming that Ted's Superstation wanted, and any future cable superstations or streamers would need for years, decades to come, right? If Ted decided to buy MGM, he would control about 35% of all the movies ever made, 2 to 3 times as many as any other studio. Y'all, opportunities like this don't come around very often, even if you're paying double what the market value is, right? You know, when you read about all this, it sounds wild, and everyone's like, I can't believe Ted would pay double the price. But how much did Facebook pay versus the revenue for Instagram or WhatsApp? As Charlie Munger or Warren Buffett would say, sometimes you pay a premium for what you need, right? And you know why? Because these opportunities don't come around very often. When you have a chance to get one of 5 major studios, you know, they don't grow on trees, you take it, right? Okay, now before we dive into the deal itself, because it's fascinating, here's my take on Ted's choice of whether to keep chasing CBS despite the poison pill and the increased debt load and all of those other provisions that they had loaded up, or going after MGM. First, taking over a company that doesn't want you and has shown that it's willing to hurt its future just to keep you away, it's not an encouraging sign of future success, right? All the willpower and ego in the world isn't going to help. Like, CBS did everything in their power to stop him. If Ted kept going and succeeded in acquiring CBS, there's no telling how bad it could have gotten. Now, in 1985, owning MGM, or for that matter, any major Hollywood studio, would have been far less chaotic than the issues that came with owning a network. I remember hearing a media executive say that the news department is 95% of the headaches and only 5% of the revenue, something like that. And damn if it isn't true. Sure, news is informative and it's a public good and all that stuff, but it's not where the money is made for these networks. But if Ted had won CBS, just imagine how crazy it would have been. They think this guy's a southern redneck crazy man. So if Ted had landed CBS, he likely would have spent years fighting decades-old internal fiefdoms, egos, and turf wars over the smallest things that don't serve customers, and none of which grow revenue, profit, or audience, all while navigating the politics of news and the public good. These are things he doesn't want to do. He already owns CNN, and he's beating the networks by over-delivering to the tune of 23 and a half hours more news every day than them. So when he's buying CBS, he's not going after the news department, but they're the ones who get all the hoopla around it. Owning a studio started to look like a much smarter play, in my opinion, because we know the value of these film libraries over time. But there was also a catch, because there's always a catch when it comes to Ted Turner. Remember, no negotiations, $1.5 billion. Well, Kirk Kerkorian didn't just want $1.5 billion for MGM. He wanted it all in cash, with no contingencies, along with a no-outs commitment. And, oh yeah, the deal needed to close in just 2 weeks, but 2 weeks for Ted Turner? Come on, please. That's like 2 months for most Type A CEOs. Ted's Type AAA. He's like the Energizer Bunny. He keeps going and going and going. Now, we all know Ted loved going big, like capital B-I-G, big. Incrementalism be damned, right? This is an America's Cup champion, an adventurer looking to make history. He's not just trying to grow his empire, he's trying to be the biggest empire ever. And this was exactly his kind of challenge. You know, it's one thing to take over CBS with no cash down. It's another to conquer one of the biggest studios in Hollywood. And if it serves the goals of TBS, even better. It also didn't hurt that part of the MGM prize was Gone with the Wind, a movie he loved so much that he named one of his kids after Rhett Butler. Now, it can't be understated how much this deal appealed to Ted after months of a very public battle with CBS executives who wanted nothing to do with him and literally dragged his name through the mud. And here you have Kirk Kerkorian on the other side of the phone, and it's someone who actually wants to make a deal. He actually wants to sell MGM to Ted. Plus, negotiating with Kirk Kerkorian was exciting, at least at first, and it had to be like a relief compared to months of dealing with the guys at CBS, you know? What a nightmare. No sleep, I'm sure. And then you get this call from Kerkorian. He's like, it's double the price of the market value. And Ted's like, well, I think that sounds much better than dealing with these CBS guys. But I can't help but think Kerkorian's approach to landing Ted was really a masterclass in getting your guy, you know? Like a seasoned fisherman, Kerkorian cast his perfect bait into the sea and reeled in his whale. That whale was Ted Turner. He played to Ted's strengths, weaknesses, and importantly, deepest desires. It's worth pointing out that a big part of Kerkorian's empire was casinos, which, you know, they know a thing or two about luring in whales and keeping them there as long as it takes, right? What I'm saying is this. Kirk Kerkorian wasn't just making a deal with Ted Turner. He was playing chess, and he was a master at it. In William Rempel's biography on Kerkorian, The Gambler, he writes how Hollywood insiders never believed Kerkorian would find a, quote, big enough sucker, end quote, to buy MGM at such a ridiculous price. And as Porter Bibbs says in his Ted Turner biography, quote, if he wasn't going to be William S. Paley, Turner may have figured, at least he could be Louis B. Mayer, end quote. But the thing was, no one had ever really tested the market value for a studio's film library. That is, until now. At this point, which is to say still early in that 2-week exclusivity window, if Ted had any concerns about the risks of buying MGM, I've yet to see them. He was focused on the upside. That's how the best founders and CEOs think. Sure, they think about the downside, but the upside is so much brighter. Career executives, the MBA types, tend to focus on protecting the downside, limiting the upside, though. But guys like Ted Turner and the other media moguls, they think bigger. They think about growing. They think about winning. For Ted, what's the point of having such massive dreams if when the winds are right, you're just too afraid to chase them, right? So he didn't bother to hide his excitement. This was it. When Ted's 2-week speed negotiations began on Thursday, July 25th, 1985, MGM stock was around $9 a share, whereas Kerkorian's take-it-or-leave-it price, that was around $28 a share, just under $1.5 billion. Not exactly a small gap between MGM's market value and what Kerkorian wanted. And almost immediately after negotiations began, Kerkorian decided, hey, I'm going to keep United Artists, which owned lucrative franchises like Rocky and James Bond. He agreed to buy back UA for $480 million, which lowered Ted's borrowing to $1 billion. But with MGM's existing debt, Ted was still on the hook for another $700 million. Add in Turner Broadcasting's debt, and he was now looking at $2 billion in total debt between the two. On July 25th, 1985, news that a deal was in the works leaked to the press. Ironically, it was CNN, Ted's own network, that broke the story, reporting, quote, the chairman of Turner Broadcasting was in Los Angeles for talks with MGM UA Entertainment Company executives, end quote. Now, by today's standards, this doesn't sound like groundbreaking news, maybe on CNBC or on Twitter, especially considering how these days media companies often report on the inner workings of their own companies, often to their own detriment. But back then, the fact that CNN was reporting on its owner's business moves was a signal of just how big this deal could be, and kind of an unimplicit way of saying, hey, Ted's not involved with the news-making apparatus here. And while I'm sure everyone at CBS's Black Rock headquarters was breathing a huge sigh of relief, but now everyone in Hollywood, specifically at MGM, wondered, what would this rambunctious Southerner with no experience making movies do with their studio? It's a good question. But he had never made news, right? And he had never owned a baseball team. And he had done a lot of stuff for the first time, right? We all have to do something for the first time. It just turned out that Ted Turner, when he did stuff for the first time, they were big things. Ted's legal advisor, George Vandeman, added, quote, we could see a shift in the wind long before the CBS situation was played out. Ted had been talking to Kirk Kerkorian since 1980, and in early July, Kirk called him and said he was ready to sell. Ted Bevins, who is Turner's CFO, and I had been in California talking to MGM for nearly 3 weeks. We had already totally forgotten CBS and were letting the Hutton team play out that hand. But we were in very serious negotiations with Kerkorian well before the end of July. Turner knew he couldn't do both deals, and he felt MGM made much more sense, end quote. Ted's lead banker, Dan Good, who was still working the CBS deal, said, quote, Hutton was just days away from announcing a new cash-heavy package to offer CBS shareholders when Bill Bevins called and said, quote, we're pretty far along on MGM now, and Ted wants everything else on hold until we know how this one works out, end quote. Now, I'm sure this call was a huge letdown for Hutton, who'd staked their comeback on Ted's CBS deal. If you remember from the last episode, Ted ended up with Hutton after CBS basically conflicted out and locked down all of Wall Street so that Ted could not really, have the best advice, at least according to them. And that left Ted with few options but Hutton, a firm with little experience with junk bonds or leveraged buyouts, to take on a giant like CBS. And to be fair, they did a pretty good job. Ted's bid for CBS was Hutton's shot at getting back to the big leagues. And while I can sympathize with him here, once Ted made up his mind, well, you know what happened next. He went all in. Now, what brought Ted out to Los Angeles wasn't just the deal itself. It was urgency created by Kerkorian, especially when he mentioned that Egypt's Al Fayed family was also interested in buying MGM. And if that name sounds very familiar, it should. Mohammed Al Fayed's son, Dodi, was in the car with Princess Diana when they were both tragically killed in a car crash in 1997. And it wasn't just the Alfayeds who might have been interested in MGM. Ted also heard that Charles Knapp, former chairman of Financial Corporation of America, had recently offered Kerkorian $22 a share for MGM UA and was flatly rejected. Now, Kerkorian was asking for nearly a third more, minus United Artists. So, with interested buyers supposedly waiting in the wings, Ted decided CBS could wait, saying, quote, without MGM, there was a question mark about the long-term viability of the Superstation. I mean, every time we signed a new movie contract, it cost us more, end quote. He added that some studios, including MGM, had even refused to license films to WTBS at any price. The Superstation made up over 80% of Turner Broadcasting's profits, and Ted knew he had to move fast to protect his core business. He added, quote, I'm in the business where the big are getting bigger and the small are disappearing. I want to be one of the survivors, end quote. That is, if someone else was even bidding. We don't know. Whether there were actually other parties interested in bidding is still very much up for debate. If someone had done their homework and simply called the Alfayeds to confirm their interest, who knows? But no one ever really did. Ted just assumed that Kerkorian was being honest. And by adding, another super wealthy and interested party into the bidding, Ted moved faster. Still, this was about to be the first acquisition of a major movie studio since General Tire and Rubber acquired RKO Pictures more than 30 years before. And it was coming together really fast, so fast that there was little time, if any, to dig into MGM's books or scrutinize what they were actually buying. George Vandeman told Porter Bibb, quote, normally you have from the time you sign the deal to the time you close to perform appropriate due diligence to verify the accuracy of financial statements related to the condition of the business, end quote. According to Vandeman, Kerkorian wasn't exactly accommodating, telling Ted, quote, I don't want to sit here forever wondering whether I have a deal. You've got 1 week to tell me whether you're in or out, end quote. That is hardball. And beyond the speed, what made this deal even more unusual was that Kerkorian insisted there be no outside investment bankers or outside advisors, just Kerkorian and MGM president Frank Rothman on one side, and Ted, Bill Bevins, and George Vandeman on the other. Vandeman recalled, quote, we went right around the clock. Ted saw things in the deal that nobody else could. He was already talking about colorizing, but it was up to Bill Bevins and me to hammer out the details. We'd meet with Ted for breakfast, then regroup at lunch, and maybe again at the end of the day. Bevins and I practically lived together for 10 days. Then Ted stepped in that final weekend to lock up the deal, end quote. Regardless, it's not surprising that Ted loved going head-to-head with a famed negotiator like Kerkorian. He was thrilled by the possibilities of owning MGM, telling Bevins and Vandeman, quote, we're getting more than a third of the greatest films ever made. We're getting Spencer Tracy and Jimmy Cagney working for us from the grave, end quote. And even when Kerkorian hinted that there weren't really other bidders, Ted didn't blink at the price. $29 a share for $1.6 billion was firm and not negotiable. Then Kerkorian added that he was not only keeping the United Artists part of MGM, which I mentioned earlier, but also the 1,457 films in the old Warner Library and the right to RKO's old films as well. He's playing hardball in these negotiations. Oh, you only have 2 weeks, and by the way, I'm going to keep those things that you really want. To which Ted immediately said, quote, if you throw in those other old movies, I'll pay the price, end quote. And that's how it's done. Boom. The $1.6 billion deal was roughly double the $826 million market value of MGM UA at the time. Ted admitted, quote, I didn't negotiate on price, end quote. So why'd Ted pay so much more for MGM than anyone else would have? Well, according to him, quote, the library is worth more to me because of WTBS, end quote. And so on Monday, August 5th, 1985 at 6 a.m., after 48 hours of nonstop negotiations, Ted Turner and Kirk Kerkorian reached a preliminary agreement. The press release read, quote, it appears that a definitive agreement has been reached. For $29 a share, approximately $1.6 billion in cash, MGM United Artists will merge with Turner Broadcasting System, becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of TBS, end quote. Ted had agreed to the deal for MGM without fully consulting his board, but the deal included MGM's Culver City studio lot, its movie production and distribution businesses, its film processing lab, and of course, most importantly, its massive, biggest in Hollywood, 35% of Hollywood's movies ever made, film library. In his memoir, Ted described the deal, quote, "Everybody put in a tremendous effort, and on August 6th, just under the wire, we signed a purchase agreement. The deal was complicated. Turner Broadcasting would acquire MGM UA for $1.4 billion, then immediately sell United Artists back to Kerkorian for $480 million. This would have brought our overall acquisition cost below $1 billion, but we also assumed $700 million worth of MGM debt, pushing our total tab to roughly $1.6 billion. We plan to work out the remaining details and get shareholder and board approvals to close the deal by the spring of 1986, end quote. He remembered the moment vividly, quote, "I was elated. We had reached an agreement to buy one of the premier studios in the world's greatest film library, but the dose of reality was that we still weren't sure how we were going to pay for it. We had been prepared to take on significantly more debt to acquire CBS, but that company had tremendous cash flow that we felt we could immediately improve. MGM was different. We didn't have overlapping operations between our companies, and given the extremely unpredictable nature of the movie business, their profits were usually low during good years and non-existent in bad ones. Adding our junk bond debt to the obligations already on MGM and Turner Broadcasting's books, our total borrowings were going to run to about $2 billion. You could say we had a tiger, or maybe Leo the lion, by the tail. And the weeks and months following our purchase would be among the most stressful, tumultuous, and exciting of my entire career," end quote. Just like with the Superstation and CNN, Ted's decision to buy MGM wasn't based on detailed financial analysis or a ton of research, because if it had been, it never would have happened. No, it was driven by instinct. Ted believed owning MGM would unlock a huge supply of programming, enough to potentially fuel new cable channels. And while he couldn't prove it at the time, if he'd been a cautious manager instead of a risk-taking entrepreneur, he never would have done the deal, right? He probably would have just walked away. In fact, I bet he would have. Scared money don't make money. But Ted wasn't walking away. And here's the funny part. After agreeing to terms with Kerkorian just under the 2-week deadline, Ted didn't even stick around to celebrate his big win. Instead, he flew straight to New York for a press conference to announce the first ever Goodwill Games, which would debut the following summer in Moscow. But once he left Los Angeles, that's when the real drama began.
Within weeks after he lost his bid for CBS, Turner had a new target, MGM Studios. The New York Times illustration said it all. Ted Turner moving in on Scarlett O'Hara, just like Rhett Butler did in the MGM movie Gone with the Wind. Now Turner owns the epic movie he loved as a child, but he's put himself into an epic amount of debt to do it. Turner says it will all pay off when he broadcasts the old MGM pictures on his Superstation.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
After Ted signed Kerkorian's 600-page agreement, just under that 2-week deadline, he'd effectively locked out any other potential outside bidders. Now, whether there were actually other bidders is a completely different question that we'll never actually have the answer to. But here's the kicker. Ted didn't actually send in a team to review MGM's books until after he'd signed the preliminary agreement to buy the company. There just wasn't enough time to pour through all of the licensing agreements, all of the movies that they own. They knew the numbers in bulk, but they don't know, for example, like Citizen Kane, who was that licensed out to? Okay, we got it in one station in Buffalo and then in Florida, but they don't know these things yet. They haven't gone through the books, which is crazy if you think about it. That is, of course, the exact opposite of how you're supposed to do a deal this big, right? Or really any deal. You want to know what you're buying and how long those agreements last, and you just got to hope they didn't license away their future, right? So in their last-minute, rapid-fire due diligence, Ted's army of 40 lawyers and analysts had to dig through thousands of licensing agreements that made up MGM's film library, figuring out not just which movies were in the library, but who had the rights to air them, for how long, and in which markets. Titles could be licensed to different stations across the country or even the world, right? And every deal had its own shape and size. They were all unique, all a la carte. And they didn't look through any of this stuff before the deal was signed. This is not something you just diligence in a weekend. Then again, the AOL Time Warner merger was diligenced in a weekend, and that's the biggest merger in history. But we all know how that turned out, right? And unsurprisingly, MGM's data was a mess. It was poorly organized, but there weren't any red flags big enough to kill the deal. In fact, the team even estimated the library would bring in at least $100 million in 1985, which is not bad considering What other cash flow would they have other than the movie theaters, for new releases and licensing? On top of that, MGM already had 6 completed new movies, which were ready for release that fall. But since there was such a tight deadline, 2 weeks to lock down the deal, nobody had had time to watch those movies, talk to the marketing departments, assess their quality, see, did we get good ones here? Are these going to be blockbusters or duds? Or take a closer look at the production operations on MGM's back lot. Ted's team, who were already stressed about servicing this massive load of debt, started to realize maybe Kirk Kerkorian had sold them a lemon. Maybe. But I'll get to that shortly. From Hollywood to Wall Street, the overwhelming consensus was clear. Ted overpaid. One analyst told the Los Angeles Times, quote, "That price he's paying is absurd," end quote. But it gets even crazier. You see, when Turner Broadcasting's own CFO, Bill Bevins, heard the price Ted agreed to, he almost choked on his cigarette. Bevins thought MGM was worth between $24 to $26 a share, which was a lot more than the analyst estimates of $22 a share. And Ted, remember, had agreed to $29 a share. Bevins said, quote, "Looking back, we knew $29 was high. Maybe the business at auction would have brought $25 or $26. Suppose we had bid slightly less. We could have lost the one thing we had always wanted for a lousy $25 million, end quote. That's a good way of putting it. You should always pay the premium if you have the opportunity, because that opportunity isn't coming back. You pay a premium often for great businesses. And that's what a lot of analysts always miss on this. Oh, no, he overpaid by $2 or $3 a share. But did he get the asset that he needed for that business? Did they grow as a result? Could they utilize the assets they were buying? That was more important, right? You see, Turner Broadcasting owed much of its growth in the early 80s to Bill Bevins' level-headed approach. He was a great CFO for the company. When Ted wanted to make a big deal, Bevins would be like, can we do this? And most of the time he would go along. But he had Turner's ear. Bevins is kind of that angel on his shoulder, being like, we don't have the money, or I don't know if we can service the debt. And Ted most of the time listened, except for this time. But with Kerkorian's 2-week deadline, all that caution went out the window with Ted's hunger for growth winning out. Bevins told Fortune magazine, quote, "The probability that we would have been able to save a great deal at auction was not great," end quote. So they know this is basically the only price they can get. They can't get a better deal on it, and Kerkorian's happy to own the asset. He just wants to get out of the film business. But does he? I mean, he kept the United Artists part of it, which has the Pink Panther and James Bond and Rocky. So he knows what he's selling here. Maybe he understands before Bob Iger figures it out in 2005 that IP is the future, because he kept all the IP and sold off the entire library, which does have Casablanca and Singin' in the Rain and Citizen Kane and The Wizard of Oz. But most of those are made once, not over and over again. I mean, I guess The Wizard of Oz is IP, but the book is the underlining IP, not the film. At the end of the day, there was only one opinion on the MGM deal that mattered: Ted Turner's. It's Ted's money. It's his company. And he needs the asset, right? He needs to grow. Ted explained, quote, "The game I'm in is building assets, and I've never minded overpaying if I know the values are there," end quote. I think Charlie Munger said something very similar. You pay a premium often on a great business. And so often we see this analysis of, oh, they're overpaying. It's like, but what's the alternative? That's the real question. What is the alternative? If it's to stay small and then get swallowed up by a much bigger company, because, Rupert's growing at this point. Time Inc. and Cap Cities and ABC, they have ESPN as well. They're thinking, we got to get bigger. And Ted Turner sees all this going on. He knows that GE is about to buy RCA, which owns NBC. That's later in 1985. They're going to get bigger. So he's going from owning CNN, Headline News, and TBS and the Atlanta Braves and saying, I'm not big enough. I need to get bigger or lower my costs so then I can get even bigger and create more cable channels, right? Think about that kind of stuff when you hear an analyst say he's overpaying. Because yes, he is overpaying, but he needs the asset, right? That said, later in this episode, you'll see just how much Ted actually minded overpaying for MGM. Okay, now, when it came to financing the MGM deal, Ted turned to the man, junk bond king Michael Milken at Drexel Burnham Lambert. Now, Ted's failed CBS bid actually involved more debt, but that debt would have been easy to service because of their cash flow from the network and all the advertising there, and from selling off all of their non-broadcast assets, right? Meaning he just would have sold off all of CBS's non-broadcast assets like the music label and then used their cash flow from the network to pay off the debt. MGM was different. A combined Turner Broadcasting and MGM didn't make enough cash to cover interest payments on debt this big. As Terry McGurk put it, quote, Ted got the advice he wanted from Michael Milken, who was the advisor to both the buyer and the seller. Ted needed to do the deal because it gave him the security of a steady supply of programming, end quote. But you see, this wasn't normal. In fact, hiring the same banker who was advising the other side of the deal was definitely not normal. Remember, CBS in the previous deal, just a few weeks before, had conflicted all these guys out. But then again, both Ted Turner and Kirk Kerkorian weren't exactly normal guys either, right? In Call Me Ted, Ted explained, quote, this was a great opportunity, and I didn't haggle about the price. Instead, I focused on the terms and tried to get the deal done quickly. I needed a banker, and the only firm that could raise this much money for us this quickly was Drexel Burnham. As I noted, I had gotten to know Michael Milken well and had been a keynote speaker at one of the gatherings that he regularly put together in Los Angeles. Drexel was already representing the other side, but we hired him anyway. There was potential for conflict, but I trusted Michael, and besides, Turner Broadcasting and MGM UA executives would deal directly with each other on the broader terms, while Milken and his team would figure out the mechanics of the financing. It's hard to imagine this kind of scenario taking place today, but in the mid-1980s, this was in keeping with the times. Unconventional deals were fairly common. I guess it's pretty clear I never had any issue with doing the unconventional, end quote. I'd say it was an unusual arrangement. So with Kerkorian's blessing, Michael Milken agreed to handle the financing for both sides of the deal, assigning trusted Drexel bankers to each camp, all reporting directly to him. Somehow, both Kirk Kerkorian and Ted Turner were fine with it. But yeah, very unusual. From there, Drexel even issued one of its famous highly confident letters, which essentially guaranteed they could raise the money to back Ted's purchase of MGM before they actually started the process of raising the money. But it signaled to the market and to investors that they were highly confident they could do it. This was as good as gold at this point in 1985. Now, if you've been following along the last two episodes, you heard me mention Michael Milken a number of times, and I've thrown around the term junk bonds quite a bit too. But to really understand the risk Ted Turner was taking on when he agreed to buy MGM in August of 1985, we need to take a quick trip back in history, Wall Street history, to discuss why junk bonds and Michael Milken were such a big deal and what was going on behind the scenes. I love these stories. So we'll talk about that right now. Now, before we move forward, I need to remind you, I am not an economist. I am not an investment banker. I've never set foot on a Wall Street trading floor. But that doesn't make what I'm about to share any less interesting to me, and I think you're going to find it very interesting too. Even if you know the history of Wall Street in the 80s, it's going to be a fun refresher. And if you don't, well, you're about to have your mind fucking blown. Now, as a longtime media operator, a lifelong storyteller, and the founder of Web Barr, the media company behind this very podcast, I've always been drawn to people who change industries forever by finding a different way of doing things and then exploiting it to the point where they change the world, right? They spot a novel or overlooked angle, and then they have the grit, the balls, the determination, to push that vision through. The second part is key. Without that vision, without that determination to see the vision through, it's just a hallucination, right? Otherwise, you're just a philosopher or a prognosticator, right? You actually have to take your insights out of theory and apply them into the real world. You have to do it. Just do it. Ted Turner is one of these guys. He did it with the satellite. He did it with CNN. And this could be in finance. It could be in tech. It could be in sports, kind of like Moneyball. That's Billy Beane. Now, Billy Beane didn't win a World Series, did he? The guy I'm about to talk about who changed an industry, he didn't just win the World Series. He was the World Series. In our last episode on Ted's attempted takeover of CBS, I mentioned that by 1984 and 85, a new kind of finance had exploded onto the scene. Today, folks call these tools high-yield bonds, but you probably know them as junk bonds. Yes, bonds had been around forever, and they'd been a huge market for decades. But by the mid-80s, junk bonds, debt so risky, they had to offer these massive yields just to get buyers, were being wielded like weapons of mass destruction on Wall Street by smaller players with outsized ambitions. Suddenly, these smaller companies, or even individuals or investors, had the power to take over corporations much bigger than themselves. And all of it came down to junk bonds and one man with a vision, a killer pitch, and years of research to back it up. And while this wasn't your classic revolution, with pitchforks and pickaxes in Fortune 500 boardrooms in the mid-'80s, it absolutely was. Ironically, Michael Milken once said, quote, "I never saw myself as a revolutionary. All the revolutionaries I know are dead," end quote. That's the most hardcore thing I have heard in a long-ass time. And yet, the leader of this revolution, this junk bond revolution, was a man working East Coast hours from his Beverly Hills office, Michael Milken. So in order to really understand Ted's deal with Kirk Kerkorian and MGM, we need to talk about Michael Milken and the junk bond revolution he unleashed. Like most revolutions, the seeds were planted many years before the mid-'80s. For our story, we'll start in 1975, when the SEC ended fixed commissions, which forced Wall Street firms to compete in ways they had never competed before. Trades went from person to person to computers, which sped everything up and sent daily trading volume through the roof. As a result, many firms reorganized, shifting from partnerships to corporations, which limited liability and allowed them to raise capital from outside investors. But perhaps the bigger challenge was the rise of a new generation of leaders on Wall Street. And they weren't from old money, nor were they from the old guard. No, they came from lower and middle class homes and rose to the top on their brains, ambition, and drive. One of these guys was Michael Milken. In the early 1970s, while working at Drexel Burnham Lambert, Milken began advocating for high-yield bonds, or junk bonds, despite skepticism from colleagues and really all of Wall Street, who considered junk bonds just that, junk. Now, I think it'll be helpful to quickly explain to my best abilities corporate bonds. In short, corporate bonds let companies borrow money from investors, then they pay it back over time with interest. And for our purposes, we're trying to keep things simple here. This is not a finance podcast. So there's two types of bonds. Investment-grade bonds, which are considered safe by the ratings agencies like Moody's, and they're usually issued by Fortune 500 companies that no one worries about how safe they are. And because they're considered safe, they pay lower interest. The other kind of bonds are high-yield bonds, or junk bonds, which pay higher interest, but come with a lot of risk because the companies issuing them might go out of business, or there's a reason for them being so risky. It's the fact that they might not be able to pay the yield to their investors. In John Malone's new autobiography, Born to be Wired, Malone describes, quote, "The term junk bonds is a misnomer because they can be a company's treasure too, as they were for TCI. Typically issued by a company with a lower credit rating, a junk bond has a bigger risk of defaulting compared with bonds issued by a blue chip company. To reward the investor for taking on this higher risk of default, a junk bond pays a higher interest rate. Junk bonds were used in a variety of ways in the 1980s, good and bad, to defend against a hostile takeover or to launch one, to expand a business organically or merge it with another one. For us, they were a lifeline. I am thankful for Milken's theories born out of his obsession and also grateful for his funding for new treatments of prostate cancer, which he had been diagnosed with himself. His Prostate Cancer Foundation has benefited many men, including Rupert Murdoch," end quote. Now, before Michael Milken, junk bonds were viewed by everyone as toxic. Most Wall Street firms avoided them, not just because of the risk, but because working with unsavory companies, the companies issuing said bonds, could hurt their reputations. Sure, their high-yield interest rates were great, if the company didn't default, but in the 70s, they weren't popular at all. They were junk. Now, Milken's pitch was simple but radical. According to him, Wall Street was evaluating companies all wrong. The ratings agencies, S&P and Moody's, focused almost entirely on past performance, ignoring future potential, which to Milken made no sense because a company's true value was its past balance sheet plus its future cash flow. And the second part was far more important to bondholders, right? Who cares about the past if you can't pay off future debt, is kind of what he's saying, And that's what bondholders need. They want to get paid, right? What Milken wanted to do was shift the focus to how companies were currently performing and their future potential, believing this approach reduced much of the risk in junk bonds. His research showed that over a long period of time, a diverse portfolio of junk bonds could actually outperform investment-grade bonds because the higher interest rates would more than offset the occasional defaults, making them far more profitable than the significantly lower yields that the investment-grade bonds would make, right? And this was a revelation, really. But just wait. I'll tell you in a minute just how he figured this whole thing out because it's awesome. And it sounds really cool, right? But here's the problem. At the time of Milken's junk bond epiphany, only big established companies with over $200 million in assets could issue bonds to institutions like insurance companies and pension funds. This meant a $500 billion market was completely out of reach for most of America's 24,000 smaller companies, which then had to rely on unpredictable bank loans or more restrictive financing options to raise capital. And not only that, Milken realized because the rating agencies only cared about past performance, size, and historical stability, just 600 to 700 companies actually qualified for investment-level credit ratings. Now, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but Michael Milken really changed the world with junk bonds. He also changed the world with his cancer research. But one of the fascinating things about him is he could have been a great chapter for Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, where it shows the moments where true geniuses, kind of like the Bill Gates of the world, were able to acquire those 10,000 hours that Gladwell says you have to really be an expert in something. And Milken is interesting because at one point in the 70s, he was living in Philadelphia, but he worked in Manhattan. And every day he would take the bus to work. And every day he would take the bus home. And those banker hours are, they're long. So on the bus ride to work and on the bus ride back, he would have stacks of paper. And in those stacks of paper, he would have years of performance charts of how bonds performed because he was, selling bonds. So he discovers on these bus rides that, oh, wow, the junk bonds, the ones that are so bad they are calling them junk with high yields, they don't default nearly as much as they should, or at least as much as the ratings companies say they do. And because of that misaligned pricing, well, wouldn't that be a good way to raise money? So that's kind of one of those novel things. It's one of those things where if he doesn't have that commute, how much longer does it take for junk bonds to become a more favored asset? Sometimes things happen the way it should, and then other times weird situations happen where a guy needs to take the bus to New York City every day and take the bus home to Philly. And he has a lot of time on his hands, and he's young. And Milken does all this in his 20s. Just imagine being the guy who figured all this out. No computers, not when he's figuring this out in the early 70s. And not just that, it's not some white paper. He acted on it, and he made a lot of money. But more so, he made a new America. As Milken weighed the risks versus the premium interest these smaller companies could offer, he started to question the entire structure of the United States capital markets. So he flipped the script. Instead of judging bonds like static, backward-looking assets, based on past performance only, he treated them more like stocks tied to growth and future cash flow. This opened the door for mid-sized companies to raise money by paying higher interest rates, making their bonds more attractive to investors. As long as they had the cash flow, then Milken could basically pull it off. Eventually, Milken even created an investment hybrid that was something like he said it was a bond, but it was basically like a hybrid between a bond and a common stock. Technically still a bond, so institutions restricted to bonds could buy it. But by paying out a large portion of its future cash flow, it acted like a stock. God, I'd love to interview Mike Milken because all of this is literally just so brilliant that someone could figure all this out. And then they had the gumption to go ahead and do it. He's in his mid-20s when he's discovering all this stuff. And when you work at a firm, you have to get approval. A lot of people would say, oh, that's a cool insight. Yeah. But this dude, acted on it. That's the key. Now, unlike the usual junk bonds from struggling companies, Milken, almost like a financial artiste, custom designed his bonds to be unrated, which bypassed the rating system entirely. He knew that if he could open up the massive capital markets to fast-growing companies or to those with huge capital needs like cable operators or casinos, they'd be lining up at his door. And these are the kinds of companies that are not going to be able to raise that much money from banks for things that need a ton of capital, like cable. You got to buy all the cable, you got to lay it out, you got to wire the systems, and then you got to buy other systems. And John Malone at the time is buying every system he can. But the banks at some point just say, dude, you have a lot of debt. You owe us a lot of money. Can you slow down? And he's like, I don't want to slow down. It's a winner-take-all kind of market, and there's only going to be 4 or 5 winners, and the rest are going to be acquired. So you need that kind of capital, and banks are more conservative, right? Well, Milken offered a lifeline to all of these guys. He saw himself as a broker connecting institutions with fast-growing companies in need of capital. But let's be real. Calling Michael Milken a broker is like the biggest understatement of the century. The dude was a kingmaker. One example Milken liked to cite was Metro Media, which owned 4 valuable TV stations and was later sold to Rupert Murdoch, forming the base of the Fox network. Now, Metro Media didn't have the past performance needed to get a high rating from S&P or Moody's, and if it had been rated, its costs would have made it look very unattractive. But you didn't need to be a financial genius in the early 80s to know that TV stations in the 80s were going to be a great investment, right? They're crushing it. People are addicted to television. And these were stations with geographical lock-ins, right? Milken later told journalist Edward J. Epstein, quote, you didn't have to know much about its past record or the number of years it paid a dividend or what letter the rating services gave it. All one had to do was be able to add together 4 numbers, the value of its stations in New York, LA, Chicago, and Boston, to find the total value greatly exceeded what it owed, end quote. So as long as you believe those stations wouldn't decrease in value for the foreseeable future, the bonds would be a safe bet. Whatever the ratings. Ignore the ratings. As long as those stations are making cash in the biggest markets in the country, you're good. This insight led Milken to a bigger realization. If bonds were tied to future cash flow rather than past performance, the old rules and even investment-grade ratings wouldn't matter. Bonds could then be treated more like common stock or real estate, just another form of risk management. But unlike a theorist or scientist who discovers a new idea and leaves it at that, or publishes it in a white paper, Milken was laser-focused on turning his junk bond vision into reality. And that's the key here. That's what the greats do, right? Can you imagine if Ted Turner, he discovers, the satellite, we're going to put the superstation on the satellite. Hey, why don't you all do it and make all the money off of it, and I'll just be celebrated for coming up with this cool idea? No, you got to follow through. You got to act. And while many dismissed him, Milken found a small group of risk-tolerant investors willing to give his approach a shot. That's all you need. You need people to give you that shot, right? The payoff came fast when high-yield bonds started delivering bigger returns for both his clients and Drexel. And that's key. Everyone is benefiting. The clients know those institutions who are investing in the bonds, and then the companies he's raising money for. It's working out for everyone. In 1973, Drexel gave him some cash, and he doubled the $2 million they gave him to invest. The next year, he doubled the $4 million. By 1976, Milken cut a deal with his bosses at Drexel that let him and his team keep 35% of their profits, reportedly earning him $5 million a year at the time, which is a lot of money, but it would be a lot more later. Drexel, which had long been considered a second-tier firm on Wall Street, saw the potential behind Milken's strategies and doubled down, launching a high-yield bond fund to attract new investors. For the first time, they underwrote a brand-new junk bond issue, raising $30 million for Texas International. And the math was pretty clear. Drexel earned 3 to 4% in commissions on junk bonds, compared to less than 1% for investment-grade bonds, making junk bonds far more profitable and shifting the firm's focus and priorities rather quickly. Inside Drexel, Milken's star was rising fast. By 1978, he had so much clout at Drexel that he told his bosses in New York that he wanted to move the entire high-yield department to Beverly Hills, closer to where he grew up. He grew up in the Valley, I think. And since he was responsible for nearly all of Drexel's profits, his bosses had little choice but to approve his requests. Incredible. By 1980, no one on Wall Street understood junk bonds or believed more in their power to transform Wall Street and corporate America than Michael Milken. And here's the thing. In 1980, Michael Milken was only 34 years old. You want a revolution? You're about to get one. Now, Milken was already a legend within Drexel, not just for pushing junk bonds and creating a market where one had barely existed before, but for being the firm's entire profit engine. After moving his team from New York to Beverly Hills, he didn't slow down at all. Despite the stereotypes of the laid-back Southern California lifestyle, Beverly Hills is a lot slower than Wall Street, Milken and his team took things to a completely new level, working East Coast hours, hitting the trading floor of his West Coast office at 4:30 in the morning, where he was known for consistently working 15-hour days and doing everything he could to help his clients. Revolutionaries don't sit back and watch. No, they take action. In a 1987 Manhattan Magazine profile, Edward J. Epstein described Milken's daily routine, quote, toting 2 dog-eared canvas bags full of reports and memos that he had taken home to read, and remains there until at least 7:30 at night. Lunch, usually a sandwich and soda, is brought in on a tray for him and everyone else at 10 a.m. He neither smokes or drinks, not even coffee, explaining, quote, I don't need stimulants, end quote. 3 assistants who work in relays starting at 4 a.m. try to keep up with him, end quote. No coffee, which is just bonkers. 3 assistants, and they're all trying to keep up with him. It's awesome. In 1979, $1 billion in high-yield bonds were issued, with Drexel underwriting $408 million of them, so about 40%. Just a few years later, that number had grown to $1.4 billion, with Drexel handling over $1 billion of it. So that's 2/3 almost. By 1980, the junk bond market was still small and was still dismissed by most of the top-tier Wall Street firms, but it was growing fast thanks to Milken's expertise and drive, and Drexel was becoming the dominant player in the space. While Wall Street's traditional firms remained skeptical of junk bonds, they could no longer ignore Drexel's success in the junk bond market. In Tom McGrath's Triumph of the Uppies, he quotes Gary Winnick, a member of Milken's high-yield bond team, who later said, quote, Mike was on a mission. I've never seen anybody in my career who has unbridled brilliance and unbridled ambition and total conviction, end quote. And that's what it takes, guys. Unbridled conviction, unbridled drive, ambition. But you also got to be really smart. I've never seen anyone make or change the course of history without being completely obsessed. You have to be. And Michael Milken certainly fit that mold. Just like Ted Turner and another of other moguls whose futures would soon depend on his junk bonds. And what do these guys all need in the 80s? What do most of them need? Because they have huge ambitions. And the banks, who lend the money at the time, they don't understand this kind of ambition. You know who does? Michael Milken. And his junk bonds could help finance that ambition, finance that drive, those dreams. And some of these guys, they wanted to change the world. Milken wanted to help them. That's what the junk bonds would do. Milken quickly became the guy for visionaries with big dreams and not enough capital. People willing to risk it all, provided they could pay off the debt with cash flow, but whose risk profiles were just too high for traditional banks. If you want to raise money to change the world, or lay a bunch of cable, or grow your cable business by buying other cable operations, the banks at some point just say, hey, man, you got to slow down. We can't take on all this risk. Milken said, how can I help you? That's a different mentality, and the junk bonds served that mentality. Take casino magnate Steve Wynn, who at the time was the 36-year-old owner of a single Las Vegas casino. Wynn needed $100 million to open a second Golden Nugget in Atlantic City, but he couldn't get traditional financing from the banks. After meeting Milken in 1978, Milken saw the opportunity and connected Wynn with investors willing to buy high-yield bonds. Wynn raised $160 million, and by December 1980, the Golden Nugget Atlantic City was open. Within 3 years, it was the most successful casino in Atlantic City. Wynn later credited Milken, saying, quote, he made me, end quote. For Milken, his financing of Steve Wynn's dreams only reinforced his belief in the power of junk bonds and in their power to transform Wall Street, but more so, to reshape American capitalism entirely. By 1983, with Reaganomics starting to fuel the economy's growth, Milken found himself at the center of the new financial world that he'd helped create. The junk bond market he'd been pushing for more than a decade had exploded. The early winners were Drexel and Milken, who tripled their 1982 performance with $4.6 billion in new offerings. The deals were bigger than ever, And Milken was helping companies, especially new ventures, get financing they could never, ever get through traditional banks. For the early 1980s, the money was huge, and these deals made Milken and his team at Drexel very wealthy. Milken famously claimed no one who worked with him for 5 years was worth less than $20 million. But these guys didn't quit and go retire. No, they just kept doing it because they loved the work. But for Milken, it wasn't just about the money. It was about overturning the old Wall Street order, the old guard, the way things were, backing companies of the future with great ideas, strong leadership, and the numbers and cash flow to make it work. Now, everyone says it's not about the money, right? But Michael Milken, he ate, slept, and breathed this. And in 1980, he was only 34. My God, I'm 40. That blows my fucking mind. His approach was more meritocratic, fueling the visionaries who could deliver, even if they weren't part of the old boys club. And as the minnows started to swallow the whales, the old guard got swept aside. Milken wasn't just financing deals. He was building a new America, and it was working. Now, let me be clear. This is not some Carney Barker magic trick. He was not a huckster selling a bad bag of goods. There's some Carney aspects, the salesmanship and all that. In a way, he's like the Wizard of Oz, where his image and aura of raising money from Mike Milken and those highly confident letters, well, if he said he could deliver, then he would deliver, right? And for years, that was the case. But all this is legitimate. None of this is illegal. The illegal aspect is insider trading or trading on information that is not public. But raising money from institutions on high-yield bonds is not illegal. Maybe if they weren't called junk bonds in the 80s, people would have a different perspective on it. But we don't call them junk bonds now. We call them high-yield bonds. In a way, Milken became like the Wizard of Oz, this great and powerful figure behind the curtain. But he worked his ass off. In Edward J. Epstein's 1987 profile on Milken, he describes Milken's way of doing business, and it's kind of unique. I'm going to paraphrase. Executives looking for junk bond financing would come to Milken's Beverly Hills office to present their case, and Milken would sit there and listen patiently. Then, in a sort of power move, he'd dismiss most of the guys in the room, keeping just a small group of 4 or 5 people. And with the chosen few, he'd lay out his own detailed analysis and strategy, often stunning all of these executives coming to him asking for money with his deep knowledge of their business. He understands their business because he's already done the work. And then just as quickly as the meeting started, Milken would disappear into the trading room, and you'd basically find out if you were going to get the money or not. Funny enough, it wasn't like he was a partner at Drexel. No, he was only a vice president at Drexel. But who cares about titles when you're getting 35% of the firm's profits and you're the kingmaker, right? By the mid-1980s, junk bonds had gone from a joke on Wall Street to the main way mid-sized companies financed their growth. While Milken didn't have a monopoly on junk bonds, his ability to sell them through his personal network of money managers made him one of the most powerful financiers in the entire world. It's really amazing how Milken built this new financial universe from scratch in such a short amount of time. Imagine being this young, in your 20s and then early 30s and having to convince a bunch of old people, yeah, I got this new instrument. And they're like, junk bonds? You want to use junk bonds to finance companies? And he's like, yeah, they don't default nearly as much as you think. And they're like, okay, let's try it. That's amazing. As Edward J. Epstein put it, quote, it's remarkable testimony to the power of a single idea, end quote, I'd say. And I love that quote. Single ideas and focus and conviction and hard work, all that stuff matters. By 1983, Milken's influence had gone from evangelist to market maker, kingmaker. People saying Michael is the market became common when referring to his dominance in junk bonds. His rise also lifted Drexel's status on Wall Street, pushing it to 6th in underwriting, all based on the back of junk bonds. But Drexel wasn't the only firm thriving. In 1983, investment banks were shifting away from the old relationship-driven model of underwriting and towards trading securities for profit. That year, nearly half of Wall Street's profits came from trading, which is a gigantic change in how these firms operated. And that's not the only big shift. In 1983 came the first big and leveraged buyouts that existed for a long time, but not like this. Starting when William Simon, former Treasury Secretary under Presidents Nixon and Ford, led a group to buy the greeting card company Gibson Greetings from RCA for $80 million. But that's not that interesting, right? First off, why was RCA owning a greeting card company? I'm sure it was cash flow, but whatever. Well, what is interesting is the methodology of financing this deal. Simon and his partners put up just $1 million in cash and borrowed the remaining $79 million. The collateral wasn't their own assets. It was Gibson Greetings itself. Just a year and a half later, they took Gibson public for $290 million, which was 3.5 times what they paid. And they only put down $1 million, right? This meant Simon's personal $330,000 investment was now worth $66 million in cash and stock, a 20,000% return on investment. Incredible stuff, right? And here's the crazy part. The whole time, they barely changed a thing about the company. The stock market was roaring. They just happened to buy it right before Reagan's economy took off on a massive bull run. And they rode that wave all the way to the top. So why wasn't everyone doing this? That's the real question. And one where a combination of leveraged buyout genius, like Ted's CBS takeover play, buy CBS with their own assets, really, and the power of junk bonds could actually change the game. These deals also confirm Milton Friedman's idea of a company, which we discussed in the last episode, had truly taken hold. Companies were no longer seen as families anymore. They were assets, and assets can be sold, traded, broken up, swallowed, not just by equals or bigger companies, but by much smaller, less capitalized players who were willing to risk it all. This was a fundamental shift. I'm not exaggerating. It changed everything. By 1983, the mergers and acquisitions market was exploding, largely fueled by Reagan's deregulation policies and Wall Street's booming market. In 1975, there were just 14 deals worth more than $100 million. By 1983, just 8 years later, there were 10 deals over $1 billion each, and the trend wasn't slowing down. Meanwhile, the collective American mood had finally shaken off the late 70s malaise. The country was charging like bulls on Wall Street into an era of optimism, money, status, and glitz. By the mid-80s, Wall Street was pure swagger. Wall Street's Gordon Gekko and Bud Fox weren't just characters. They were archetypes, role models, inspirations. And thanks in large part to Michael Milken's junk bond empire, deals were getting bigger, riskier, and more lucrative than ever, which only fed the hunger for more money, bigger checks, and bigger deals. It's like a flywheel. Of course, culture reflected the moment with Jay McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City, and the iconic film The Big Chill, as well as MTV's new dominance on cable television. Money, sex, drugs, exuberance, and breaking from their parents' America of the 50s and 60s was very much in vogue. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Michael Milken's Predators Ball, which was their annual conference, which kind of was like a Catalina wine mixer or iPhone keynote mixed with Biaconal on Wall Street, where you'd have keynotes, but also everyone went there to kiss the ring, raise some cash, and have a blast. And the annual Predators Ball brought together Drexel's top institutional investors, junk bond diehards, the real evangelists, the people who bought into all the hype, and then entrepreneurs from small to mid-sized companies hoping to score capital from Milken's team. It was also a victory lap and a show of Milken's team's dominance in the market space, all on Michael Milken's terms, with events at the Predators Ball beginning every day at 6 in the morning. The first event began in 1979, probably a much tamer, more understated event called like Drexel's High Yield Bond Conference, something like that, and it drew just 60 attendees. By 1984, the Predators Ball had grown into a 4-day extravaganza of 1,500 guests, all there to pay homage to the world Michael Milken had built. And it wasn't just business. It was a mix of deal-making along with like tier A entertainment, where one year Diana Ross performed and the year before, Frank Sinatra. But make no mistake, the Predators Ball wasn't just a party. It was where serious business got done, where investors snapped up Drexel-originated junk bonds, funding young companies, and racking up massive fees for the firm. As one Drexel banker put it, quote, "Whatever the conference costs us in the millions, We made it up in the first hour because deals were being done, end quote. If you want the full story on Milken's rise, fall, and rise again, with the Milken Institute, I highly recommend reading Connie Bruck's The Predator's Ball. It's a phenomenal book. It's not too long, and it really details all this stuff, and she's one of the best. Also, her book on Steve Ross, Master of the Game, is incredible. And so, by 1985, the economy was booming, and almost all major American M&A seemed to orbit around Michael Milken or his ideas. His power wasn't just on display at the Predator's Ball, but every morning at his Beverly Hills office, where executives would line up as early as 5:30 in the morning just to meet with him. Now, if that scene sounds kind of like the opening scene at the wedding in The Godfather, where everyone waits for their turn to speak to Don Corleone, I don't think it's very far off. Legendary investor and corporate raider T. Boone Pickens said of meeting Milken, quote, "I thought, who in the hell is this guy? He talked very authoritatively, like, sit down and listen. He came in very handy for us. He doesn't hold back. If he knows anything, he'll sure as hell share it with you," end quote. While Milken's bond desk had built its reputation backing smaller outsider companies, they were now, in 1985, starting to work with Fortune 500 clients, using their junk bonds to fund massive acquisitions. You see, despite his wealth and power, Milken saw himself as much more than just a moneymaker. He believed many large American corporations were really poorly run, which really shortchanged the shareholders. To him, his junk bonds were the solution. They were already fueling big mergers and friendly leverage buyouts, but Milken's bigger ambition was to use them for hostile takeovers, forcing change, rewarding shareholders, and in his view, saving corporate America from itself. Damn. Now, when it comes to explaining what these junk bond fuel takeovers were like, the best comparison I've read comes from Tom McGrath's Triumph of the Yuppies. Quote, "Fiscally speaking, it was like your average Joe neighbor buying the local millionaire's mansion with a few $1,000s down and the rest charged to a credit card. The millionaire's credit card," end quote. So, with deals flying out of Milken's X-shaped desk in Beverly Hills, people started to wonder, was any company in America actually safe from corporate raiders backed by junk bonds? The idea that nearly any small or mid-sized company with a bold enough leader could take over a Fortune 500 giant was mind-blowing. For the companies targeted in all these takeover attempts, and for most of corporate America, the speed at which all of this is happening was dizzying. Remember, all the executives at ABC, NBC, and CBS were watching their world literally flip upside down in a matter of months, all thanks to junk bonds and bold, enterprising raiders eager to own their networks. And you get the picture. Milken's pitch of cutting bloat and improving American businesses sounded great in theory, right? But at what cost? That's the real question. At what cost? Was it destroying institutions? Was it cutting costs or shifting wealth around? I don't know. But it must have been wild if you were in one of those Fortune 500 boardrooms, right? And it kind of reminds me a little bit about how AI companies tell us AI will change the world for the better. But if it kills us in the process, was it worth it? Exactly. Anyways, if you look past the headlines, Michael Milken's story is one of a man who made incalculable contributions not just to finance, but to health and medicine as well. But that's a story for another time. Okay, so now you're caught up on Michael Milken's story. Let's get back to 1985, specifically August 1985. Ted Turner has agreed to buy MGM. He needs financing, and there's only one man to call, Michael Milken, with one highly confident junk bond offering. Now, when we last left, Ted Turner agreed to buy MGM, with Michael Milken advising both Turner Broadcasting and MGM's Kirk Kerkorian, which was a very unusual arrangement. But if we've learned anything this season, it's that with Ted Turner, unusual tends to be the norm, right? Now, remember, Kerkorian insisted on an all-cash, bulletproof deal, but Ted didn't have that kind of cash. Turner at the time is probably worth like $500 or $600 million, and he's buying a $1.6 billion company. So he doesn't have that kind of cash. So Turner turns to the man who could give him the world, the junk bond king himself, Michael Milken. And just as Milken had financed Rupert Murdoch's Metro Media deal, which became the foundation of Murdoch's Fox network, Ted went to Milken. Now, to Ted, Owning MGM, the iconic studio born from the 1924 merger of Metro Pictures, Goldwyn Pictures, and Louis B. Mayer Pictures was a dream. Meeting with MGM execs, he told them what he'd told the press for years. He wanted to make family pictures, films that inspired and harkened back to another era. He wanted to tell stories that showed American ingenuity at its best. Of course, like any industry, when an outsider enters their orbit, Hollywood wasn't necessarily buying it. One producer told Turner biographer Richard Hack, quote, "If Turner starts to let his personal convictions affect what pictures get made or what themes they have, he will drive the company into the ground," end quote. And that's predictable. This kind of thing happens every time a media company is acquired, where people in media, whether it's news, Hollywood, tend to be very skeptical of outsiders with designs on changing the order of things. They are always skeptical of new technologies or startups or anyone who doesn't have their credentials. But those are the people normally who change things, right? If you look at all the movies that MGM's making, it's not like they are crushing it in the mid-'80s. So with Milken's assurances, Ted felt confident he could quickly sell off parts of MGM to cover the immediate debt, while using the long-term value of MGM's film library to pay down the rest. Ted said, quote, "Mr. Kerkorian is no dummy. He knew what he wanted to sell, and what he sold was the troubled part of the company, and I bought it. Normally things aren't for sale if they are in great shape, right?" End quote. It's pretty astute. So with due diligence out of the way, and I use that term as loosely as possible, Ted and Mike Milken got to work. These guys, Ted and Mike Milken, were thick as thieves. Both had similar mindsets that were very hostile to incumbents at the time, and they were eager to tear down the old way of doing things. Like Ted, Milken had been predicting the fall of the big three TV networks for years, telling Forbes, and I'm paraphrasing, quote, "I began telling clients in 1981 that NBC, CBS, and ABC would fall behind, just like how special interest magazines overtook big mass-market publications like Look and Life. It was only a matter of time before TV followed the same path. Cable may have looked like a bad investment at the time, but it was the future. To prove my belief, I helped raise hundreds of millions of dollars to support John Malone's growing cable empire when the banks wouldn't lend him any more," end quote. And we talked about that earlier. John Malone said this of Milken, quote, "The rise of Milken and the firm Drexel Burnham Lambert created a revolution in deal financing for us. Their agility to buy and price offerings dramatically changed the acquisition game and saved me incalculable hours in front of clients on road shows. We knew what level of debt and the terms that were available if we had Drexel on our team." Milken was made the poster boy for Wall Street excesses after the crash of 1987. In a plea bargain deal in 1990, he pled guilty to 6 felony counts, including securities fraud, mail fraud, and tax evasion, and served 22 months of a 10-year sentence after cooperating with authorities and getting time off for good behavior. He was fined $200 million in order to pay $400 million in restitution to investors. His issues with Uncle Sam notwithstanding, what I know is that Mike Milken proved his thesis that non-investment grade bonds were undervalued relative to investment grade bonds, and he helped TCI raise a lot of money perfectly legal, just as he had with Ted Turner and many other U.S. companies, end quote. You see, Milken loved clients like Ted, the types who weren't just bold and outspoken, but eager to disrupt the establishment. They wanted to win, to create a new future. After watching Ted's battle against CBS from the sidelines, he was excited to help. He assured Ted that despite the risks of all that debt, Drexel could finance the deal. And why wouldn't he be confident? He already knew MGM's financials since he was their banker, and he had helped Kerkorian raise $400 million the year before, so he knew the financials quite well. But despite the obvious conflict of interest, he vowed to keep Turner Broadcasting's information confidential. But not even one of Milken's famous highly confident letters, which acted as a de facto guarantee that a deal was as good as gold, could calm the growing doubts surrounding Ted's MGM deal. On August 16, 1985, the Wall Street Journal wrote, quote, "Despite the Drexel letter, it remains unclear whether Milken can raise the funds, and if he does, whether Turner can ever support the huge amount of debt which the deal will heap upon Turner Broadcasting," end quote. Basically, as soon as Ted and Kerkorian closed on August 6, 1985, Milken realized the deal would need to be restructured, both to better appeal to investors and for the debt to be more manageable to Ted. And almost right away, as all this is happening, MGM's summer movies, the ones that Ted's team didn't have the time to watch and assess their quality, because they're expecting a certain amount of cash coming from those, well, they started bombing in the theaters, one after another. At the same time, the studio's production costs were spiraling out of control. And so all of this is happening, and there's all this debt, and they see all the cash flow coming from Turner Broadcasting and the lack of cash flow coming from MGM, and it's not enough. And it starts to spook Milken's usual group of junk bond institutional buyers, guys who usually follow Milken into every deal without question. So, if these guys were worried about Turner's ability to pay off the debt, then that is a very bad sign. When Milken checked with his top institutional junk bond backers, it was clear the original agreement wouldn't cut it. They'd need a much stronger offer to push it through. Naturally, some suspected Ted had been taken advantage of, but everyone, including Ted, brushed off those accusations. But let's be honest, Ted wasn't in a strong position. Far from it. Remember, Ted admitted he didn't negotiate on price with Kerkorian, but it didn't matter. Now, Milken was his only option. And despite juggling a number of complex takeover deals in 85 and 86, Milken was really the only person on Earth who could raise this kind of money on such a tight deadline. Still, any kind of restructuring of this deal would come with much higher stakes for both Ted and Turner Broadcasting. But here's the thing, and I can't emphasize this enough. In 1985, for guys like Ted Turner, Kirk Kerkorian, and Michael Milken, nothing felt impossible. And why would it feel impossible? Kerkorian had bought, sold, bought back, sold so many assets, it was like commonplace for him. And Ted made the impossible normal. Milken made financing the impossible an everyday occurrence. To them, a deal was always within reach. Now, as part of his initial deal calculus, Milken explained, quote, in 1970, Lorimer had a library of old TV films which it was carrying on its books for zero. We used this zero book value asset for financing based on the earning potential of the Lorimer library and syndication. No one had ever done that before. And with Turner, we used the MGM library as collateral, even though Kerkorian had written the value of those old movies down to zero. He added, actually, they were appreciating assets, not depreciating assets, since each time they were put out for rental, the rental rates went up. And for Turner, they were also a guaranteed source of future programming, end quote. So this is kind of one of the first times where someone says, hey, wait a second, film library is not a depreciating asset. It's going to make money in the future, like for a long time. Still, those trading profits were nothing compared to the $68.4 million placement fee that Milken and Drexel stood to earn once the $1.4 billion junk bond deal closed. So, in order to get their fee, Milken needed to find a way around MGM's worsening financial situation. Now, Milken also, in a lot of these deals, would put his own money into what the investors were also buying so that he could share both sides. So he would gain and win with the investors. And I think that's fine. John Malone did that all the time with Liberty Media investing in cable companies while also running TCI. You want to share the wins with the industry, right? Now, in the middle of all their rapid fire due diligence in early August, something actually did slip through the cracks. So I remember earlier I said no big red flags showed up that would stop the deal. Well, there was one item that slipped through the cracks, and it could threaten the entire deal. You see, just 2 days before Ted signed his agreement with Kerkorian on August 6th, MGM UA had sold the MGM Library's pay TV rights to Rainbow Service Company, a small cable distributor on Long Island. Now, Ted's team knew about this deal, but they never actually seen the contract, because if they had, they almost certainly would not have moved forward with the MGM deal. Their contract gave Rainbow the right to block MGM movies from being shown on certain cable networks. And of course, one of those networks was the superstation TBS. Ted's legal advisor, George Vandeman, recalled, quote, Rainbow was able to sucker MGM into granting them exclusive basic cable rights, and that would have killed the deal for us, end quote. So this was a huge problem, right? Especially since their whole plan to service the mountain of debt relied on running MGM films on TBS and then creating future Turner channels, which would run those movies all the time as well. But like I just said about all these guys, nothing was ever truly impossible, even contracts, right? Like, do you really think a small cable service on Long Island was going to stop Kirk Kerkorian from selling MGM, or Mike Milken from getting his fees, or Ted from getting his plethora of programming? Come on. No way. For these masters of the media universe, these were just bumps in the road. So, Kerkorian sued Rainbow to break the contract that he'd signed just 2 days before his deal with Ted. Naturally, Rainbow countersued. And all the while, Milken could see the entire deal, with its tens of millions of dollars in fees, slipping away. But if Ted ever had second thoughts about walking away from this previously considered ironclad deal, this was his out. This was his way of saying, okay, this is too much for me, and this is too risky, and I'll just go somewhere else. Guys, this was his out. But he didn't want out. He was still moving forward, no matter what. Kerkorian and Milken didn't necessarily know that, so Milken stepped in, urging Kerkorian to settle the issue with Rainbow. And after 6 weeks of back-and-forth drama, Rainbow finally agreed to tear up their contract for $50 million, with Kerkorian covering most of that payment. It was just another in a long line of massive hurdles handled with the stroke of a pen on paper, with a lot of zeros. In another age, it would have been a duel with a gun or a sword fight to settle the score. It reminds me of that quote in Die Hard where the blowhard yuppie Ellis says,
"Now, it's none of my business. I figure you're here to negotiate. Am I right?"
You're amazing. You figured this all out already.
Hey, business is business. You use a gun, I use a fountain pen. What's the difference? Let's put it in my terms. You're here on a hostile takeover. You grab us for some green mail, but you didn't expect some poison pill was going to be running around in the building. Am I right? Hans, Bobby, I'm your white knight.
Exactly, guys. Now, as the summer turned to fall in 1985, Milken hit more unexpected resistance, placing the junk bonds for the sale. His normal investors were still wary, doubting whether the combination of Turner and MGM, with less than $200 million in projected free cash flow, could handle the $1.5 billion in high-interest debt. And that's not an unreasonable thought. It didn't help that MGM's fall slate of films in 1985 were, well, they were bad. Their next 4 films were The Year of the Dragon, Codename Emerald, Marie, and Fever Pitch, which is not the Jimmy Fallon, Drew Barrymore one. And they cost more than $100 million in total. But they brought in just $5 million in box office receipts. That's bad. 5% on 4 movies? That's a 95% loss? Holy shit. A very frustrated Turner CFO, Bill Bevins, said, quote, "Dogs, hell, you couldn't feed these films to dogs. Things really got bad when the studio went into free fall." He added, "MGM was a deteriorating asset. We simply weren't getting what we thought we paid for," end quote. Interestingly, the only box office hit that fall for MGM UA was Rocky IV. You know, Drago! But since Kerkorian had kept United Artists for himself as part of the deal at the last minute, he was the beneficiary, not Ted. By fall, just weeks after the deal closed, MGM's losses were mounting. Debt was piling up. And even Michael Milken, the goddamn junk bond market himself, couldn't convince his loyal investors to bite. This was nearly a worst-case scenario for Ted. You know, he's locked into this deal, and he needs to service the debt or else, right? Now, I have no clue, no idea whatsoever, how Mike Milken was able to convince Kirk Kerkorian to change his stance on altering the deal. But you got to know, like, Kerkorian was old school. He liked everyone to know that when he signed a deal with a handshake, that was it. Signed, sealed, and delivered. All he needed was a handshake. But there would be no redos, no renegotiating, no changing the terms. His biographer, William Rimple, wrote in The Gambler, quote, "Never in decades of closing tough deals had Kirk ever been asked to restructure a formal agreement so substantially and so often as in the case of the Ted Turner deal," end quote. But somehow, in October 1985, Milken got him to agree to $477 million less in cash, dropping the cash portion of the deal from $26 a share to $20 a share. And to make up for it, Ted issued new TBS preferred stock to Kerkorian and MGM UA shareholders, leaving Milken's team with a more manageable $1.2 billion in junk bonds to sell and a better shot at landing their fee. The purchase price stayed at $1.6 billion, but Ted also agreed to assume $578 million of MGM's debt, which puts the total to $2.1 billion. $480 million of that would go back to Kerkorian because he bought back UA. But yeah, you got all that? And I know I mentioned Kerkorian was keeping United Artists. Well, now it was officially back to him. But that was well known to everyone before the deal was even signed. Anyways, even with the reduced cash requirement, Milken's junk bond buyers were still hesitant. MGM's losses kept growing, and the studio would soon report a $26 million net loss for the quarter ending November 30th, following their miserable summer of box office bombs. Turner CFO Bill Bevins said, quote, "When you suffer the kinds of losses we suffered at the studio, the financing becomes a nightmare," end quote. I'd say. In his memoir, Ted explained the entire situation pretty clearly. Here's what he said, quote, "After signing our deal, and while we were waiting to close, MGM released a string of movies that flopped, one after another. The industry in general was having a tough summer, and the slate that MGM produced was performing particularly poorly. We knew what was in their pipeline from our due diligence, but it was difficult to know that this list represented one turkey after another, including Year of the Dragon starring Mickey Rourke and Codename Emerald, a World War II drama with Max von Sydow. MGM released about one movie every month, and on average, each title was losing about $15 million. It got so bad by the following summer that when Paramount was touting a much-anticipated summer release, I joked, they have Top Gun, and we have Bottom Gun. People who had already been critical of the high price we paid for the studio were now speculating that Kerkorian knew he had bad movies in the can and was wise to sell when he did. That may be, but in fairness to Kirk, he showed us the list and let us make our own judgment. He never warranted they would perform at a certain level, just that they would be released on certain dates and supported with specific marketing budgets. I wanted MGM's current production, but my interest in the studio was largely centered on the library. It was hard for me to believe that they would run up about $100 million in losses from these movies over the next 12 months, but they did, making a difficult situation that much harder. As early as October of 1985, we felt we would have to make serious changes to our deal if we were ever going to close. Some suggested that we find a loophole and pull out of it, but I felt we could find a way to make the deal work, end quote. In fact, it might have been better if Milken's bond offering had failed, because the new deal with TBS preferred stock being issued to Kerkorian in lieu of cash wasn't your standard issue run-of-the-mill preferred stock. You see, it came with two dangerous provisions that had the potential to not only sink the deal with MGM, but could cost Ted control of Turner Broadcasting. First, in a move to reassure Milken's already nervous and wary investors, Ted committed to paying off $578 million of 14% notes by September 1986, which was just 11 months away. In order to raise that kind of cash, Ted, who hoped to use MGM's production facilities to make original programming for TBS, the Superstation, which would have been a massive leveling up for the cable network. You know, they're running mostly sports and reruns. He would have to sell most of MGM's non-film library assets, including the studio itself. What this really means is almost as soon as Ted Turner owned MGM with the iconic studio backlot and all the perks that came with being a Hollywood mogul, he was going to have to sell it all just to hang on to his real prize, MGM's film library. In fact, he'd end up selling most of the studio before he even officially acquired it, which is pretty wild if you think about it. Now, the second provision was far more dangerous for both Ted and TBS. The first one's just paying off that debt for $578 million in a year. So the second one, instead of cash, Ted gave Kerkorian 53 million shares of preferred Turner Broadcasting stock. And that stock came with complex dividend requirements. Here's how it worked. A year from the agreement, the preferred shares would start earning dividends of $1.45 each. But Ted wasn't allowed to just buy the preferred shares back unless he renegotiated the junk bond debt. And he couldn't pay the dividends in cash until he paid off $900 million in debt, including the initial $600 million, which is $578, I'm just rounding up, due in September of 1986. Instead, he had to pay those dividends by issuing new shares of Turner Broadcasting common stock. And if Turner Broadcasting's common stock price dropped below $15 per share, that's when things would get much, much worse. Ted would then have to issue even more preferred shares, giving those shareholders both common and additional preferred shares. All of this would cause the total shares of the company to balloon, which would dilute Ted's ownership and put him at risk of losing control of his own company. This is like a ticking time bomb kind of thing. To put it simply, Ted wasn't betting his company on his programming ability or his swagger to beat the networks or even his talent to create and build new cable networks. No, he was betting his entire company, the one he built brick by brick for over 15 years, on one thing: generating enough cash to cover both the preferred share dividends and the junk bond payments, all while hoping and praying TBS's stock price didn't drop below $15 per share, something he really can't control if there's sharks in the water. And all of that had to happen on the tight deadlines buried in the fine print of this new agreement. Fine print that Ted later admitted he didn't read closely, saying, quote, "I'm not an accountant," end quote. We know that. Now, did Ted understand what he was getting himself into? Absolutely. And yet he pushed ahead anyway. Now, I know all this sounds really complicated, and it was, because here's the risk. If TBS's stock price tanked and the dividends couldn't be paid, Ted wouldn't just lose control to some random group of institutional investors. He'd lose control of his company to Kirk Kerkorian, the master negotiator himself. Turner CFO Bill Bevins explained the worst-case scenario, which I'll paraphrase. Quote, "In a worst-case scenario, Turner might be unable to pay the preferred dividends in cash, and the price of the common stock could drop to $10 and remain there. If that happened," Bevins explains, "the number of common shares would explode by the early 1990s, drastically reducing Turner's 81% ownership to a much smaller percentage. Meanwhile, Kerkorian's share of the common stock, currently at 0, could grow larger than Turner's, potentially giving him control of the company," end quote. And guys, listen, yeah, I know I've said this before, and I know I sound like a broken record when I say it, but this really was Ted's biggest battle yet. And this time his enemy wasn't some rival network or the government or Major League Baseball executives. No, it was math, financial spreadsheets. Could he make the numbers work or not? The Los Angeles Times summed up Ted's situation perfectly with the headline, "MGM deal could cost Turner his own firm," which is the perfect setup to dive into 1986 and what could be the final act of Ted's MGM story. Or is it? By the end of 1985, the United States had seen over 3,300 corporate mergers worth more than $175 billion, which was more than 5 times the number from just a few years earlier. But one deal still hadn't closed: Ted Turner's purchase of MGM. Now, that finally happened on March 25th, 1986, just 8 months and a couple failed bond sales after the original agreement was signed. What it took to get this deal over the finish line was a combination of Ted's boldness and hunger for a film library, Michael Milken's incredible persistence to get the deal done, and Kirk Kerkorian's rare willingness to bend his own old-school mentality and rules to get a deal across the finish line. Milken later said Kerkorian, quote, "couldn't have been fairer on the deal. I always saw him making sure the other guy got a fair deal," end quote. That said, Ted was now loaded up to the gills with an estimated $1.9 billion of debt. But Ted proudly boasted, quote, "I owe more money than anyone else in the world," end quote. Which I guess you might as well embrace it, right? I mean, I love it. How could you not? Being depressed about the asset you just bought would suck, but at least he's excited about it. I mean, you've got to admire Ted's bravado, right? He's saying something like this because he knows there's a ticking time bomb of his own making, and if it goes off, well, you might as well just take the Turner name off the building, right? Ted later described the situation, quote, "By the end of March 1986, we had officially closed our deal. That was the good news. The bad news was that the terms stipulated that we pay off our $600 million in junk bond debt by September. MGM was operating at a loss, having just released more box office failures, including 9.5 Weeks, and Turner Broadcasting was barely squeaking by, even before we layered on these additional commitments. In fact, I don't think we expected our revenues to exceed $600 million over those upcoming 3 quarters. Making matters worse, Kerkorian's new preferred shares carried dividend obligations, and our debt covenants prevented us from paying these in cash until our bond obligations were taken care of. In the absence of cash, we'd have to use Turner common stock. The situation was dire, and the only way to raise $600 million in cash was to sell assets. As much as I love the idea of being in the movie business, I would have to live without a studio. The one thing I absolutely insisted that we keep was the library, end quote. So, in a nutshell, Ted bought MGM Studios, a nearly bankrupt studio with an iconic film library, and ended up without a studio, without a backlot, without all that, equipment, without the film processing lab. And instead, he had a mountain of debt and the iconic film library. Ted realized the only thing he could really do at this point, other than service the debt, was accentuate the positive, the power of positive thinking. No point being negative, since any negativity could easily be reflected in TBS's stock market price. One analyst called it, quote, "It's one of the nuttiest deals of all time." Another doubled down, saying, quote, "Ted Turner came to town fully clothed and left in a barrel," end quote. Now, I know all of y'all know this kind of criticism wasn't new for Ted, kind of being made fun of for, oh, what a nutty deal. And then normally he wins out. But this one hit differently. This time, since the stakes were so high financially, and it's not like he's waiting on a competitor to fail, this time it's all on him. And it came with this mountain of debt. But with that massive $578 million debt payment due in September of '86 looming over Turner Broadcasting like a real ticking time bomb, Ted knew his dream of being a Hollywood mogul was over. Over. And everything from MGM's production and distribution arms to its film lab and even their iconic Culver City MGM lot were gone. His only real win in the final deal was convincing Kirk Kerkorian to throw in 1,450 extra United Artists films. Not the Rockies or James Bonds of the world, but enough to bring his total number of movies to 3,650 in the deal. By TBS's own flying by the seat of their pants projections, at least 1,000 of them would have enduring commercial value. And since Ted planned to run them forever on TBS or any potential channels he might launch in the future, that mattered more than anything. Sure, a number of those movies were tied up in licensing deals for years, but Ted didn't care. Now, what mattered most was that he finally owned more product, so he doesn't have to worry about the rates getting jacked up on him. That's why The Wizard of Oz is on TBS still to this day, all the time, right? A banker at Drexel even joked, quote, "It's a good thing Turner's mind is always 5 or 10 years ahead of everybody else. He can now begin planning how he's going to use these movies in 1995, end quote. Still, the overwhelming consensus in both Hollywood and the media was that Ted overpaid. But it only added to Kerkorian's reputation as one of the greatest deal makers alive at this time. One Hollywood insider went so far as to say, quote, "Turner got the worst screwing in the history of American business," end quote. Even Turner Broadcasting CFO Bill Bevins admitted it would take 4 years before they saw any financial benefit from owning MGM's library rather than just licensing the movies. After closing the deal in March of '86, Ted and Milken set their sights on tackling Ted's $600 million debt due that September. That's really close. That's a lot of money to raise by selling off assets, right? And yet, Ted did his best to put on a positive face throughout all this. Even with these incredible levels of debt, he bragged to his mom, quote, $2 billion I owe. Actually, it's closer to 1.9, but I like the sound of 2 billion better. His mother replied, "Oh my, how much did he say?" Ted shouted, $2 billion. No individual in history has ever owed more. His mom replied, "Oh, Ted, I get a headache thinking about it." "Well, you're honest. You'll try and pay it all back, I know." To which Ted confidently said, "That's $1 million a day in interest, Mother. Here, look at my picture in today's newspaper. Do I look worried?" End quote. But things didn't get better when Ted learned that some of the movies he bought to air on TBS were also already spoken for. Time Inc. executives told him, quote, "Well, Ted, we've leased a number of those films. They're locked up," end quote. Ted's reaction was predictably classic. Quote, "God damn it! I've never done anything like this before," end quote. By 1986, the writing was on the wall. Even if Ted and Milken had held out a little bit of hope that they would be able to hold on to the studio, I've already said that he was going to sell all those assets, but now he knows officially he was going to have to sell off assets to make that initial $578 million September payment. Drexel hit the market seeking bids for all of MGM's assets, minus the film library, with a total asking price of $600 million. In June, Ted toured the MGM lot with cable heavyweights like John Malone, Time Inc.'s Nick Nicholas, and HBO's Michael Fuchs, before meeting to figure out how to make the MGM deal work, and in the process, save Ted's empire. And while all of them strategized, Ted sat off to the side, just scribbling numbers on the back of an envelope, trying somehow to figure out a way to salvage the deal, to keep the studio. One of the executives recalled, quote, "I was thinking about the way our company would do it. 9 million accountants, 10,000 lawyers. Here was Ted doing this deal on the back of an envelope," end quote. You know, that's just Ted's mentality, right? Never say die, never give up, but also never waste a dime. By the first week of June, the bids were in, and on June 6, 1986, Warner Telepictures, a fast-growing TV production company known best for making Dallas, the TV show, and already a tenant on the MGM lot, agreed to buy MGM's real estate and film lab for $190 million. So there goes 190 of the 578. But the bids for the rest of MGM's assets were coming in much lower than expected, which is when, yes, the master opportunist himself, Kirk Kerkorian, saw his opportunity to buy back, yes, the very studio he'd sold to Ted just 3 months before. Ted explained, quote, "The Drexel team went to work, and by early June, we sold the production company, the home video business, and the rights to the MGM logo back to Kirk Kerkorian for $300 million, and the studio lot and film laboratory to Lorimer for $190 million. Meanwhile, we managed to keep the RKO and pre-1948 Warner Brothers libraries and the rights to one of my favorite TV series, Gilligan's Island. We did the best that we could do, but it was painful giving up MGM. As I mentioned before, when we entered the TV business, I had never watched much TV, and I wasn't a fan of network news before launching CNN. But I had enjoyed movies since I was a kid, and I was sorry not to retain the studio. But we had still managed to acquire the world's greatest movie library, and now it was time to make the acquisition work. As Scarlett O'Hara said in a movie I now own, after all, tomorrow is another day," end quote. So Kerkorian jumped back in and bought the remaining MGM assets, including MGM's iconic Leo the Lion logo, their production and distribution operations, and United Artists debt-free, all for $300 million. That's an incredible $100 million profit on something he had just sold months earlier. And I'm sure you're wondering, why would he want to buy the very studio he had worked so hard to sell? Simple. It was an easy win. He was so used to buying and then selling and then buying back and then selling back assets that, he was not sentimental about this kind of stuff. Sell high, buy low. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that Kerkorian knew these assets were worth more than what Ted was now asking for. And he knew Ted needed to sell ASAP. He is so good about timing this stuff. He put Ted on the 2-week timer, in August of 1985, and Ted made the deal. And now Ted needs to sell ASAP. And so what does he have Ted on again? A timer. Ultimately, it wasn't personal. It was just good business. Incredible stuff, if you ask me. And now that Ted had sold everything except for MGM's film library, he was finally free of that massive initial September 86 payment. This meant he could start airing MGM's movies like his favorite Gone with the Wind, as well as Casablanca, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Singing in the Rain, It's a Wonderful Life, Miracle on 34th Street, and Citizen Kane, all on the Superstation. That's a haul, guys. In the end, Ted wound up paying a net price of $1.1 billion for MGM's library of 2,110 classic films, plus the rights to another 1,450 Warner and RKO movies, most of which were in black and white, and you're going to want to remember that detail for multiple reasons, whether it's colorization or TCM, Turner Classic Movies, in the next episode. And at an average cost of around $300,000 per title, some analysts were now starting, of course, after the fact, that's how it always happens, starting to see the value, especially since network sitcoms in 1986 were already costing between $300,000 and $400,000 for a single half-hour episode. And these movies, they're well known. These are not pilots that Ted is buying. He's buying sure things when we're talking about Wizard of Oz or Singing in the Rain or Citizen Kane. So basically, Ted's getting these well-known hits that are, sometimes 2-3 hours long, 4 hours long with Gone with the Wind. And he's getting all those for $300,000 if you break it down. And they're sure hits. He doesn't have to worry, are people going to like this? Because we know they're going to like it. Still, most analysts thought Ted overpaid by $300 to $500 million. If the MGM library was worth roughly 10 times its 1985 cash flow of $80 million, they figured a fair price would have been closer to $800 million. Even so, media analyst Paul Kagan said, quote, "No one has ever lost money owning a film library," end quote, which Ted knew was true, but then again, no one had ever paid what he just did for a film library either. Still, even Ted's biggest critics began to admit that a lot of people preferred watching timeless movies, classics like Citizen Kane or The Wizard of Oz on TV, over the more forgettable here today, gone tomorrow, potentially gone forever because they can only air them a few times and there's no DVR shows on the networks. And while Ted lost the studio, he did get in the deal MGM's collection of dozens of Oscar statuettes, which he soon proudly displayed in Turner Broadcasting's hallway. I think that part is hysterical, and if I ever bought a company and started putting their Oscars in my hallway, you should carry me off and put me in jail because I didn't earn those, but whatever. It's his history now. He bought it. Ted shrugged off criticism of the deal, saying, quote, "It's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, but we won the game," end quote. Well, yes and no. Sure, he landed his prize. He got the film library, but he still had to sell off the entire studio. And remember, he'd only paid off the first part of the debt. Things sure as hell weren't over. No way. The real danger was the newly issued TBS preferred shares he'd given Kerkorian. And those were the kinds of shares that could actually cost him control of the company. So no, the game with Kerkorian wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Turner Broadcasting still had a mountain of debt to pay off. TBS CFO Bill Bevins said that after paying $110 million in interest, the company might manage to scrape together $10 million in cash flow for 1986, but with depreciation and other expenses, they'd likely post a $200 million loss, which would be a big blow to their growing company. In Call Me Ted, Ted said, quote, "When the dust settled on our deal, Kirk Kerkorian was praised for profiting handsomely by simply selling some assets to me at a high price and buying them back for less. Some have speculated that he took me to the cleaners, but I thought he was honorable throughout the process, and we've remained friends. But friendly or not, I owed him a lot of money. And while our core businesses continued to perform well, we had lost money on the Goodwill games that summer, and it was becoming clear that it would be difficult to pay Kerkorian without refinancing. Otherwise, we'd have to compensate him with newly issued stock, greatly diluting my Turner Broadcasting holdings. If we weren't careful, control of the company could shift from Turner to Kerkorian. Once again, my back was up against the wall. I needed capital, but where could I turn? Who would have an interest in helping me stay both afloat and independent? It didn't take me long to conclude that the cable operators would be my best bet," end quote. In a July 7th, 1986 issue of Fortune magazine, they broke down Ted's options for the debt. Quote, "Retiring that debt could cost $800 million, $300 million for the debt with restrictive covenants, and $500 million for the preferred stock. If the projections are right, Turner could eventually cover that from the cash flow left after debt payments. But he might want to retire the preferred stock sooner rather than later, especially if the common stock price drops, which could lead to the dreaded dilution of shares. His quickest route to raising cash would be selling shares in his cable networks or a portion of Turner Broadcasting. But so far, Turner has been extremely reluctant to part with anything he built himself," end quote. And if TBS ever sold more common stock, Ted was clear, quote, "I'd like to hang on to 51%, end quote. Which makes a lot of sense, right? It's better than 49%. He needs to keep majority ownership. Fortune added, quote, "Turner Broadcasting probably could issue stock without diluting earnings per share, so long as it used the money raised to pay off debt. Telecommunications, timing, and other operators of cable systems have considered making major investments in Turner Broadcasting. In a large private sale, the per share price might range from $40 to $60, much higher than its recent market price. One potential investor half-jokingly says that investing shareholders' money in a company controlled by a risk-taker like Turner might constitute a breach of fiduciary duty, end quote. And that's in Fortune magazine. My God. So to sum it up, even after unloading all of MGM except for the film library, Ted was still buried in debt with no clear plan and very few good options. Sure, he kept the 3,600 or so films he wanted so badly, but he was still more than $1 billion in the red. And if he missed any of these payments, well, Kirk Kerkorian could foreclose. So, to solve his debt problem, Ted knew he would probably have to sell TBS assets or a big chunk of TBS stock, which would then reduce his 81% stake in Turner Broadcasting. But in classic Ted Turner fashion, he stayed upbeat, taking it all in stride, putting a far more positive spin on things than most would have been able to, saying, quote, "I've got more stuff than anybody ever had in the history of the world. I have an Indian headdress, an African outfit, and this set of glass Tiffany dice. I've got my copy of the America's Cup up here on the mantle. I've got a poster of the MGM lion on a beach. I'm a proud father of 3 baby bears. My bear Yogi on my plantation just had cubs. I've got a lot of stuff I didn't have before. I've got a dove nesting right here on the windowsill. I've got more awards than anybody my age. I've probably got more debt than anybody in the world. That's something, isn't it?" End quote. Alan Ladd Jr., the former vice chairman of MGM UA under Kerkorian, had actually agreed to work for Ted before he sold the studio back to Kerkorian, but he quickly fell under Ted's spell and ended up staying on after the deal. He would say that Ted was the most unusual boss he'd ever had, which says a lot because we're talking about Hollywood, where unusual is usual. Ladd said, quote, "He was very charismatic, and on top of everything else, he turned out to be a very decent person. Everybody thought he was out of his mind making the kind of deal he did with Kerkorian, including me. He had no eye for the movie business, no experience whatsoever. Well, everyone else was wrong, and he was right." End quote. Ted believed that, excluding the MGM library, Turner Broadcasting was worth at least $60 per share. He figured he could get $1 billion for CNN and over $700 million for TBS. The MGM library alone should bring in $100 million a year, with another $100 million from his cable networks. But the problem was almost all of that cash would go straight to paying down the company's enormous debt, $1.6 billion, after he had paid off the $600 million in September of '86. That summer in 1986, speaking to a room of Hollywood bigwigs, Ted asked, quote, "How can you go broke buying the Rembrandts of the programming business when you are a programmer? The studio and the library would have sold for at least $1 billion or $1.2 billion to somebody, so I might have paid $300 million more than anybody else." Then he doubled down. "I paid full value, and value to me was greater than to anybody else because I had a distribution system that once sold movies, and I like old movies. I've never done anything like this before. It's like sailboat racing in a hurricane. It's like being in an airplane in a storm. You buckle your seatbelt and hope for the best." End quote. I mean, let's be honest. How can you not be romantic about Ted Turner's never say die attitude?
And if Turner gives a damn, he wouldn't admit it to talk show host Larry King, who asked him how he's going to pay it all back.
When someone owes a bank like $500 million, do you get a payment book?
No, I don't know. I mean, debt is staggering. It's going to be close to $2 billion, but, that's more than some third world countries are.
How did Ted Turner from Atlanta get in more debt than some third world countries?
Now, at this point in 1986, maybe more than ever, Ted was up against it. But how many times have I said that before this season? Or even this episode? Dozens this season for sure, right? Well, this time he was in a straight-up fight against the numbers. He had to keep his company afloat and protect his majority stake, not just from falling into Kirk Kerkorian's hands, but also from a number of other vultures circling Atlanta. Remember, this is a time where corporate raiders are literally acting like barbarians at the gate. And, it's the same time as the RJR Nabisco takeover. So he needs to make sure that his fortress is protected. Ted put it best in mid-1986, quote, "Business is tough right now, but listen, for me, business has always been tough. I grew up in a tough neighborhood. We pioneered everything we started. We pioneered ad-supported cable. We pioneered 24-hour news. We pioneered global networks. We've had to fight and scrap every inch of the way against entrenched, powerful competitors. We've survived and none of our competitors have. They're there, but they've all changed hands and are in different forms," end quote. And the thing is, Ted never lost his trademark swagger, his confidence, saying, quote, "If you bet against the field, you win all the time," end quote. He told Ken Auletta, quote, "They laughed at me when I started with CBS. They laughed at me when I started CNN. They laughed at me when I bought the Braves. They laughed at me when I bought the Hawks. They laughed at me when I bought MGM. I spent a lot of time thinking, and I did not fear because of my classical background. When Alexander the Great took control when his dad died, he was 20 years old. He took the Macedonian army, which was the best army in the world at the time, and conquered Greece, got the Greeks to join with him, and they marched across the Hellespont and invaded Asia. They didn't even know where the world ended at the time. And he was dead at 33. 13 years later, he kept marching. He hardly ever stopped, and he never lost a battle," end quote. That's Ted Turner. This is what he was born to do. Goes back to episode 1, where I discussed that Ted was Alexander the Great to his father's Philip. Ted was trained for this. Absolute positivity and a never say die attitude. And it's still inspiring today, right? But inspiration and positivity don't pay down debt. So it's worth looking at how Turner Broadcasting was actually doing in mid-1986. By July 1986, TBS was in 36 million homes and was cable's biggest, most profitable ad-supported network, pulling in about $70 million in operating cash flow. You see, before flywheels became an overused buzzword in Silicon Valley, the Superstation was the engine that kept Turner Broadcasting moving forward. Its revenue fueled the launch of CNN and Headline News, both of which were in the black by 1986 with over $30 million in cash flow. Remember, Ted was patient with those networks. He never worried too much about short-term losses as long as the networks were growing, both in audience and on cable systems. As Ted said, quote, "The game I'm in is building assets," end quote. That said, even in good years, cash at TBS was always tight. As Ted kept chasing more acquisitions to expand his empire, that prized MGM film library, his biggest coup to date, was starting to feel less like a coup and more like a noose around the company. Fortune reported in July 1987 that Turner Broadcasting had posted net losses in 5 of the last 10 years, and that its record pre-tax operating profit in 1985 was only $17 million. Still, their stock market valuation in July 1987 reached $600 million. Since February of 1986, the stock had gone from $12 to $28 per share in July of 86, largely thanks to John Malone's Telecommunications, the largest cable operator at the time, buying 3% of TBS shares for under $15 million. Malone, though, warned that TBS's volatile stock was, quote, "not for widows or orphans," end quote. A ringing endorsement, right? Now, despite the crushing debt, Turner Broadcasting's overall performance in 1986 was impressive. Revenues were climbing, and MGM's library alone was already bringing in $125 million. Ted's belief in the library's value was being proven right, but analysts didn't really care. Instead, they just focused on TBS's $121 million net loss and overlooked the fact that he'd already paid off more than $200 million in interest that year. Still, the real danger Ted faced was the $15 per share threshold tied to Kerkorian's preferred dividends, because if TBS's stock ever dropped below $15, Ted would have to issue more stock to Kirk Kerkorian, risking a chain reaction that would make a nuclear bomb blush, and that would dilute his control. And despite a booming stock market, Wall Street doubts kept TBS's stock hovering around $15 all through 1986 and into early 1987. In the July 7, 1986 issue of Fortune magazine, Ted said, quote, "I may make a mistake someday, but buying MGM wasn't one of them," end quote. And sure, it's possible Ted was just sugarcoating things, but I don't think so. He is not one to sugarcoat. But inside TBS, everyone knew things were dire. Once the initial excitement of selling the studio back to Kerkorian faded, reality really set in. If Ted didn't cut the debt within 6 months, he'd have to pay Kerkorian in TBS stock, which would open the door for Kerkorian to take control. And to make matters even worse, Kerkorian wasn't the only threat. Turns out Rupert Murdoch was also circling Ted's debt-ridden empire like a vulture. And if you know anything about Rupert, we're not going to talk too much about him right now, but you should know that he is ruthless. When he sees his prey, he normally gets it. So yeah, Ted was cornered. If he stood still, he risked losing everything. And all the while, the last 18 months had taken a very visible toll on Ted. You have the failed CBS takeover, the fight to close the MGM deal, and now the crushing debt. It wore down on the usually tireless Ted Turner. He'd lost more than 10 pounds. He'd even stopped getting the at-home haircuts from his wife that she'd been giving him for years. At 47, his hair was turning snow white, and it was finally clear Ted wasn't the kid battling the white hairs anymore. Now he was a white hair. It became clear Ted couldn't shoulder the rest of his $2 billion debt load. He later admitted, quote, "Assuming things don't work out the way I planned, I'm going to do what I've always done. I've been running this company for 23 years, and virtually every one of those years, someone predicted I was either going to lose control or sell out or go broke," end quote. By the end of 1986, TBS's obligations to Kerkorian were coming due, and Ted couldn't meet them. He had just 5 quarters left before he'd lose control of Turner Broadcasting, and without a white knight, even Ted had to face the possibility that he might lose control of the very company that bore his name. So at 5:30 in the morning in early 1987, Ted picked up the phone and called a lifeline. When the phone rang, Leslie Malone heard the southern drawl on the line and immediately passed the phone to her husband, John Malone. "It's that asshole friend of yours." "Hello?" Calling from Atlanta, an exasperated Ted Turner said, quote, "John, you've got to do something. You've got to do something." "What have I got to do, Ted?" "Something, or else CNN will become KNN." KNN? What the hell is KNN? And then Ted yelled into the phone, "Kerkorian News Network!" End quote. You see, Ted wasn't just in trouble. He was desperate. The first dividend payment to Kerkorian was due in just a few weeks. And without the funds to pay it, Ted faced the possibility of having to dismantle his own empire just to cover the bill. And it wasn't just Ted feeling the heat. The ramifications of a default were obvious and scary to cable operators like John Malone. I mean, can you imagine Rupert Murdoch swooping in and buying CNN at a discount? They know what Ted's going to do with CNN because they've seen it over the last 7 years. They don't know what Rupert Murdoch would do. When he bought the New York Post in the late 70s, he changed it completely. And they don't want that. So when Ted picked up the phone to call John Malone, the CEO of telecommunications that morning, he wasn't calling a rival. He was calling a longtime cable ally, someone who actually cared about his situation. Because here's the thing. Remember in episodes 4 and 5 how I mentioned that the cable guys always stuck together? Sometimes they negotiate against each other, to get better deals and better leverage. And they still stick together, though. A weaker Turner Broadcasting System worried cable operators because TBS was their best ad-supported channel and CNN had no real competition. They wanted a strong Ted Turner to keep growing TBS and creating new channels. And why? Because those new channels brought their cable systems more subscribers, and more subscribers meant higher cable bills. Meanwhile, a world without Turner Broadcasting Systems, imagine it was just broadcasting systems, that alternative world would have been far worse. Unthinkable, really. Try imagining Kirk Kerkorian actually creating new cable channels with Ted's new programming assets. You can't, right? Kerkorian's a great operator, but he's more of a buy, sell, buy back, sell kind of guy. He's not a cable guy, per se. And even Kerkorian knew that. He liked Ted. He didn't want to run CNN, but he did see an opportunity. By simply waiting for Ted's debt to crush him, Kerkorian could expand his entertainment empire into cable without lifting a finger. And as tempting as that was, even he admitted, quote, "I don't want him squashed. Ted's a good man. He doesn't make excuses. He tries to do the right thing," end quote. And yet, The clock was ticking. So once Ted hung up the phone on John Malone that early 1987 morning, they got to work. And in the weeks that followed, well, I'll have to save that for the next episode. Still, all of this reminds me of a scene in The Godfather Part 2 where Michael says,
"My father taught me many things here. He taught me in this room. He taught me, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer."
On the next episode of Media Moguls, we'll find out whether Ted Turner loses his media empire to Kirk Kerkorian, or if John Malone and the rest of the cable cowboys ride to his rescue. We'll also explore how CNN went from a scrappy 24/7 news network to a global institution that would redefine news forever from Baghdad in 1991. We'll take a look at Ted's latest battles as he fights to keep growing in a rapidly changing media landscape, one that was dominated by new mergers and acquisitions, and this time, he's not the center of attention. All of that and more in the penultimate episode of Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga. Until then, I'm Web Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga.